When the hidden truth of time came to light, everything changed. A family secret, once buried in dark tales of the past, became the key to a murder and a lost mind. Every ticking clock, every moment of silence, was just a piece of a bigger puzzle, one that revealed a painful truth, a truth that had been waiting to break free. Do you dare to understand this agony? If so, this story is for you, the one who seeks to lose themselves in the depths of time. The house stood in eerie isolation at the very edge of Dorrington Chase, a place where time itself seemed to weave its own narrative. Tall, narrow, and defying the conventional designs of a proper home, it was more of a curious structure, a monument to obsession. Its odd shape was made even stranger by the chimneys that tilted at awkward angles and the windows, far too many for comfort, each one reflecting some secret hidden in the folds of the house. But what truly made the house unique, unnervingly so, was the sheer number of clocks that filled every nook and cranny. It seemed that each room, every hallway, even the very space above the coat rack, was marked by a clock. Some ticked, others chimed, while a few clicked or hummed, creating a chorus that would unsettle even the most accustomed to time's passage. At precisely 10 minutes to noon, the largest of the clocks, a brass-cased grandfather clock in the entrance hall, let out a deep, ominous strike, though no hour had yet arrived. It rang out once, low and thunderous, like the toll of a bell mourning a loss long forgotten. Its sound rolled across the wooden floors like a shadow, causing Miss Georgina Lawton to stop mid-knit, her eyes narrowing at the sound. "That makes 3 times this week," she muttered under her breath. Her knitting needles paused in mid-air. From the kitchen, a younger voice, sharp and dismissive, echoed back. "It's always that one. I told you it's gone mad. Get rid of it, Georgina." A familiar tension built within her, a quiet frustration mixed with the weight of years spent in this house, where the clocks ruled over everything. With a grunt, Georgina rose, her back protesting as she stood up. The ache in her lower spine seemed to speak in time with the clock's rhythm, as though her very bones had learned to adjust to the steady ticking. With slow, deliberate steps, she made her way to the entrance hall, her eyes fixed on the grandfather clock that loomed like a silent sentinel. It had not stopped, nor had it strayed from its usual rhythm. But something about it felt wrong. Not fast, not slow, just wrong. The pendulum swung in its usual meticulous arc, but there was a sense of chaos in the precision, a quiet rebellion. Her fingers hovered near the clock's case, but before she could touch it, the sharp sound of the front bell rang twice, abrupt, jarring, cutting through the stillness like a knife. It wasn't the chime for a visitor. It was the ring reserved for deliveries, a sound so familiar that it was almost a part of the house itself. With a sigh, Georgina walked toward the door and opened it to find the postman standing there, an unreadable expression on his face. "Morning, Miss Lawton. Special delivery," he said, his tone matter-of-fact as his gloved hand lifted the brown envelope, already sealed with the unmistakable stamp of urgency. She took the envelope from him, nodding mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the wax seal, the heat from the wax almost unnerving against her skin. She watched the postman walk away, his footsteps fading on the gravel path, and closed the door behind her with a soft click, the sound too final in the stillness. Inside, she unfurled the letter, her heart picking up pace as she read the neat calculated handwriting. "Miss Lawton, at the risk of alarming you, I must ask, has the house been set to chime at 13? If so, it is of the gravest importance that you respond immediately." The words hit her like a jolt of electricity, cold and strange. The very idea of a clock striking 13 was absurd, impossible. Clocks struck on the hour, or perhaps half past at most, but never 13. She blinked, her eyes darting to the nearest clock, a small one near the parlor window. It ticked away with innocent indifference, unaware of the storm brewing in her mind. "Chime at 13, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ridiculous. She crumpled the letter and tossed it aside as if it might burn her hands. But even as she did, A strange unease settled in her chest. Something, somewhere in her mind, shifted, as though a door long closed had been cracked open. A memory, faint and shadowy, stirred in her thoughts but remained out of reach. That afternoon, the house seemed to pulse with a quiet anticipation, the ticking of the clocks growing louder in the silence. Georgina knew she couldn't ignore this. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that had remained hidden for far too long. She reached for the telephone, dialing the number of the village solicitor first. The conversation was quick, impersonal, but she could sense the unease in the solicitor's voice, as he assured her he would look into it. Next, she called the local newspaper editor, asking him to look into any strange happenings in the village, though she had no idea why. And then, with trembling fingers, she dialed the number she had not dared to dial in 17 years, the number she had long ago buried in the deepest recesses of her mind. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice on the other end, low and familiar, said, "Miss Lawton. Something strange has happened. It's starting again." The words tumbled out, desperate and disjointed. "It's all starting again." She didn't say much more. There was no need. The call had already set things in motion, a chain of events that would bring Hercule Poirot to Dorrington Chase, a place where a crime, long buried under the weight of time and secrets, was waiting to resurface. And with it, the house, the clocks, the ticking, the unanswered questions, would reveal their dark hidden truths. The request arrived unexpectedly, a cryptic message, urgent and strangely specific. "Come to Ashmore House immediately. A matter of utmost importance concerning the anomaly in our household timekeeping. A strong sense of danger is present. Regards, Victoria Ashmore." Hercule Poirot stared at the letter, the paper creased slightly, where it had been hastily folded. The words carried a weight that made the air around him thick with unspoken warnings. Captain Hastings, standing beside him, gave a soft chuckle as he glanced at the message. "A historical anomaly in timekeeping," he mused with a raised eyebrow. "That's quite a phrase, isn't it, Poirot?" Poirot, however, did not laugh. His eyes, sharp and calculating, remained fixed on the letter as his fingers traced the delicate edge of the paper. "It is not a joke, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice low but firm. "It is an echo, a whisper from the past that refuses to remain buried." Hastings, confused, tilted his head. "An echo? From what, exactly?" Poirot's gaze grew distant, as though peering into a fog of forgotten memories. "You recall the Ashmore affair, yes?" Hastings paused, his mind sifting through old cases. "Ah, yes, I do. A scandal some decades ago involving the Ashmore family. Financial ruin, wasn't it? Alleged embezzlement, bankruptcy." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "So the papers claimed," he murmured. "But I suspect, Hastings, there was more to it than mere unpaid debts. Far more." The train's whistle broke the silence as it slowed, the countryside station of Ashmore coming into view. The air was thick with mist, obscuring the surroundings, giving the place an eerie, almost ghostly quality. It was a modest station, no grandeur, just a simple, forgotten stop on the tracks. Only a lone porter stood under a shelter, waiting for something, or someone. Poirot's polished shoes clicked sharply against the platform as he stepped off, his movements precise and deliberate. Hastings followed, carrying their luggage, though his eyes never strayed far from Poirot's sharp, calculating expression. As they made their way down the platform, a figure emerged from the fog. Victoria Ashmore, clad in a heavy black coat and a fur-lined hat, was waiting for them, her face pale, her features drawn tight with the unmistakable look of concern. "Monsieur Poirot," she greeted in a voice that was low, yet steady. "Thank you for coming." Poirot inclined his head, his usual courtly grace intact despite the tension hanging in the air. "It is my honor, mademoiselle." "You are troubled?" Her eyes flickered for just a moment, and then her expression hardened. "I am," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "And something dreadful is happening at Ashmore House." The drive to the house was fraught with an unsettling silence, the road winding through dense woods before emerging into a long, desolate driveway. On either side, crumbling stone walls lined the path, as though trying to hold something together that had long since fallen apart. At the end of the drive, Ashmore House stood like a dark sentinel, its looming silhouette barely discernible through the thick fog. Poirot had seen it years ago, but now, it looked even more sinister, tall, narrow, and oddly shaped, like an architectural mistake clinging to the edge of time itself. The house seemed to breathe, to move with a life of its own, its many windows staring down like watchful eyes. They entered through the heavy iron door, and the atmosphere inside was immediately oppressive. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but something else lingered, something cold, metallic, almost oppressive. The moment they stepped into the grand hall, Poirot's eyes were drawn to the walls. Timepieces of every kind adorned the space, grandfather clocks, pocket watches, mantel clocks, all ticking, chiming, whirring in perfect, discordant harmony. The steady ticking echoed in his ears, growing louder with every step. "There are more clocks here than in a watchmaker's shop," Hastings remarked, his voice uneasy. "But Miss Ashmore, why so many?" Victoria's face darkened, her lips tightening into a thin line. "It's not the number of clocks that matters, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's what they're hiding." She led them into the drawing room, where a fire crackled faintly in the hearth. As she spoke, her eyes never left the large, ominous grandfather clock standing near the door. "Last night," she began, her voice dropping to a whisper, "it struck 13. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "13," he echoed, his eyes flicking to the clock. "Are you certain?" Victoria nodded, her hands clasping tightly in front of her. "At midnight?" "No, just after midnight." The clock struck 12, and then it rang again. 13 times, Poirot. I stood there, staring at it. I counted. No clock is built to strike 13. Poirot approached the grandfather clock, his eyes scanning the intricate wooden casing. His fingers moved deftly along the sides, opening the delicate doors of the clock, and examining the inner workings. "This is an old French timepiece," he murmured. "But it has been altered. Someone has tampered with it." Victoria's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and relief. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it. But that's not all." She reached into her coat pocket, and pulled out a letter, handing it to Poirot. He read it slowly, his lips tightening as he absorbed the words. The letter was brief, yet chilling. "Monsieur Poirot, I trust this reaches you in time. There is something wrong at Ashmore House. Time itself seems to have become twisted, and the clocks are but a symptom. A warning. Be careful. The past is catching up." Poirot glanced up from the letter, his expression grave. "This letter," he murmured. "It was sent by someone who knows of the house's history. Do these initials, LP, mean anything to you?" Victoria's eyes flickered with recognition. "No, nothing. Should they?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead he turned back to her, his voice calm but insistent. "Who else lives in this house, mademoiselle?" Victoria's gaze shifted, her posture stiffening slightly. "No one, Monsieur Poirot. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Delaney, who comes by during the day, and there is Robert who maintains the clocks. But, no one else. Not anymore." Her voice faltered. "Not since the last death. The last tragedy in this house 20 years ago." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing, as he processed the information. "So it begins again," he said softly. "The tremor, then the quake, the 13th chime, and soon, another death." Victoria's face paled further, and she clasped her hands tightly, her fingers trembling. The house, the clocks, the letter, it was all coming together. But what lay beneath it, what sinister force had twisted time itself in Ashmore House, was still a mystery. And Poirot knew that the solution, as always, lay hidden somewhere within the past, waiting to be uncovered. The wind howled through the branches of the ancient trees that lined the path to Dorrington Chase, sending a cold shiver across the landscape, as if nature itself had been stirred by the strange happenings inside. Inside the drawing room of the Lawton residence, Poirot sat in an old wingback chair, the fire crackling softly in front of him, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. A porcelain cup of tea rested gently in his hand, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that seemed to pervade every corner of the room. Hastings, though usually a man of action, was absorbed in a well-worn book of timetables, his mind clearly elsewhere. Georgina Lawton had retired for the evening, her nerves too frayed to allow for any more company. The house, despite the crackling fire, felt eerily still, as though the very air was holding its breath. All around them, the clocks continued their relentless ticking, their sounds echoing throughout the large shadowed room, as if mocking the very concept of time. Each clock was a prisoner of its own rhythm, some ticking louder than others, some slower, some with the delicate chime of an old-world cuckoo, others with the stern strike of brass bells. The grandfather clock, an imposing figure by the door, suddenly gave a deep, resonant strike, shattering the silence at precisely midnight. Hastings looked up, his eyes narrowing. Another strike followed. Then another, and then, at the stroke of the 13th, Poirot rose from his chair, the porcelain cup slipping from his fingers and crashing to the floor as his gaze locked onto the clock. "Hastings, do you hear it?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "Yes," Hastings murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But how is it possible?" Poirot did not answer. Instead he moved toward the grandfather clock, placing a hand on its polished surface, as if listening for something more than just the echo of the 13th chime. And then, there it was. 3 sharp knocks, not from the front door, but from the rear entrance, the one that led to the garden. Poirot's eyes flickered with recognition. "Come, Hastings," he said, his tone urgent. Together they crossed the long corridor, passing rooms that seemed to exhale cold, forgotten air. Poirot opened the back door to find nothing but the overgrown garden, shrouded in mist, the moonlight barely making an impact. But Hastings spotted the trail. There in the soft earth were muddy footprints, clear and deliberate, leading from the garden gate to the rear entrance. Poirot crouched beside them, his sharp eyes inspecting the marks. "Size 10, he muttered. "Or 11. Recently walked, damp, and look here." He pointed to a small, consistent nick in the heel of each print. "A man came to the house, Hastings. And he arrived precisely as the clock struck 13. Hastings, clearly unnerved, scanned the empty garden. But why would anyone approach like this, at midnight, and not at the front? It makes no sense. Poirot's gaze shifted back toward the orchard, where the rustling of leaves only added to the silence. Because such a person does not wish to be seen, not by the neighbors, nor by the lady of the house. He stood, motioning for Hastings to follow. "Let us check the study." The study was small and unassuming, with only a tall mahogany desk, and a few bookshelves lining the walls. Poirot's eyes moved over every detail with practiced precision. The windows were securely locked, the fireplace cold. But then a slip of paper caught his eye, neatly folded, almost carefully placed on the blotter. He unfolded it, reading the message aloud. "The clocks are not the only things running out of time." His voice dropped as he handed the paper to Hastings, who looked at it with growing unease. "A warning?" Hastings asked, his brow furrowing. "Or perhaps," Poirot murmured, "a threat. Either way it cannot be ignored." They returned to the drawing room, where Poirot resumed his seat, his thoughts clearly consumed with the message. The fire crackled, casting fleeting shadows on his face, and for a long moment, he sat in silence, his fingers tapping rhythmically together. Finally his voice broke the stillness. "Hastings, do you recall the case of the Countess of Lavenham, the one with the missing?" By the time dawn broke over Dorrington Chase, the rain had ceased, but the oppressive sky remained a dull, unyielding gray, heavy with the promise of more to come. The house, with its unrelenting tick of clocks, seemed to stretch time itself, as though caught in a perpetual loop. Inside, Georgina Lawton entered the breakfast room, her composure fragile, and her movements deliberate. Mrs. Fell, the housekeeper, went about the room in silence, her eyes furtively glancing toward Poirot and Hastings. The clink of silverware and the rustling of buttered toast filled the room, but the tension in the air was palpable. Poirot sat in quiet contemplation, his eyes distant, his thoughts consumed by the mysteries unfolding before him. "Did either of you hear it?" Georgina's voice broke the stillness, sharp with unspoken dread. Poirot raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving his coffee cup. "The chimes, mademoiselle?" he asked, his voice measured. "Yes," she replied, her hands trembling slightly as she poured her tea. "And the visitor?" Poirot's gaze softened as he placed his cup back on the saucer. "We heard the knock, and found footprints in the garden. But no one was there." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment the room felt colder than it had any right to be. Georgina's fingers clenched the teapot, as though it were a lifeline. "I've told you about the clock," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But the rest of this house, it's full of memories. Some I wish I could forget." Poirot leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Difficult memories often cast long shadows, mademoiselle. Let us walk through them now." Georgina hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if she had resigned herself to revealing something long buried. "There's something you need to see." They moved silently down the long hall, the faint creak of the floorboards the only sound. She led them into the library, a grand room with towering bookshelves, and a scent of aged wood and leather that clung to the air. The soft morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting faint beams onto the portraits that lined the far wall, formal photographs of the Lawton family from generations past. Georgina stopped in front of the last one, her eyes lingering on the sepia-toned image. "This is my father, Lionel Lawton," she said, her voice quiet, but steady, pointing to a man with sharp, angular features and a drooping mustache. "And my mother Evelyn. There in the corner, is me," she added, tracing the image of a young woman with a serious expression. Her finger moved slowly to the last figure, a young man, his eyes sharp, almost mischievous, a faint smirk on his lips. "That's my cousin, Alistair," she said, her voice tightening with the weight of memories. "The black sheep, always in trouble, always too clever for his own good." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "He disappeared?" Georgina nodded, her eyes drifting over the photograph. 20 years ago, he was here staying for the summer. One night, he had a violent argument with my father in the study. No one ever saw him again. The police searched the house, found nothing, no sign of violence, no body, no note, but his suitcase was still in the guest room, and the back door was ajar. She paused, the weight of the memory hanging heavily in the room. After that, the clock began its madness. The chimes, 13 strikes, always at midnight. Hastings frowned, his brow furrowing. "Was there a formal inquest?" he asked, his voice heavy with the implications of what he was hearing. "Yes," Georgina replied, the word bitter on her tongue. "It was ruled inconclusive. Voluntary disappearance, they called it." Poirot stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the photograph, studying Alistair with a quiet intensity. The young man's expression was almost too casual, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, something that seemed to hint at knowing more than he should, a trace of mischief that wasn't quite innocent. Poirot took a deep breath, and turned toward Georgina. "And the clock, mademoiselle," he said softly. "It did not simply begin chiming 13 by chance. No, this is not a coincidence. Someone is trying to send a message that has been hidden for far too long. And perhaps, someone is still hiding something they fear we might find." His gaze flicked to the others. The chiming of 13, Hastings, was not a malfunction. It was an invitation. Georgina's face paled, her fingers twitching as if she were about to speak. But Poirot's voice cut through the tension before she could. "And this house, this maze of time and memory, someone intends to keep it locked away, in every sense of the word." The rain had long since ceased, but the heavy, sullen clouds still clung to the sky, as if unwilling to release their grip on the world beneath them. Dorrington Chase stood like a monument to the past, its clocks ticking away in their strange, deliberate rhythms, unsettling in their insistence. Georgina Lawton entered the breakfast room with a controlled air of composure, but her fingers betrayed her, trembling ever so slightly as she poured her tea. The silver service gleamed on the table, yet it did nothing to mask the tension that hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Fell, the housekeeper, moved silently around the room, her eyes flickering toward Poirot, as if waiting for him to speak, to reveal what it was he had seen the night before. He had heard the chime, the knock, and he knew it was not just coincidence. There was something far deeper, far more dangerous at play. Georgina's voice broke the silence. Barely a whisper, but it hung in the air like a confession. "Did either of you hear it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The chime? The knock?" Poirot, who had remained in thoughtful silence, merely raised an eyebrow. "We heard it, mademoiselle. We heard the chime and the visitor," he said, his tone almost casual as he took another sip of coffee. "But the footprints, they led nowhere." The words hit the air with a coldness that sent a shiver down Hastings' spine. He had been quiet, his mind racing to make sense of it all. "And the clock?" Georgina asked, her eyes wide, as if searching for a logical explanation in the face of the inexplicable. "The clock. It's been acting strange, I told you. It chimes 13 times. Always at midnight." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, standing to his feet and brushing invisible dust from his jacket. "But it is not a malfunction. It is a message. Someone has sent it. Someone who wishes to distort time, to hide a truth." His voice grew more intense, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Someone is hiding something here. Something they do not want us to find. Something they fear might be uncovered." He paused, letting the silence stretch out, heavy with unspoken implications. "And that," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was not just a malfunction. It was an invitation." By morning the gloom of the night had not lifted, and the house still felt unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Georgina, stiff and pale, led them into the library, where the thick air of age and history hung around them. The room seemed frozen in time, and yet something felt disturbingly alive within its walls. The portraits of the Lawton family, stiff and formal, stared down at them, each one telling a story that seemed half forgotten. Her finger paused on one of them, an old photograph of a man with sharp features, and a gaze that was both confident and calculating. Alistair Lawton, the black sheep of the family, who had disappeared without a trace 20 years ago. "He vanished," Georgina said, her voice heavy with the weight of years spent searching for answers. "One night, after an argument with my father, he was gone. No sign, no note. The police said it was a voluntary disappearance. No foul play." Poirot stepped closer to the photograph, his eyes scanning every inch of it, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "But a disappearance," he murmured, "is never what it seems. A man disappears not only to escape others, but to escape himself, or perhaps to make room for something else, something he plans to return to." As Poirot continued to study the image, something caught his attention, a slight anomaly. A book, dust-covered yet recently touched, stood out among the shelves. He pulled it down, its title catching the light just enough for him to read. "The Principles of Mechanical Timing, First edition, 1896. His fingers flipped through the pages lazily, until something fell out. A photograph, smaller and modern, showing Alistair Lawton, older now, his face harder, yet the same unmistakable eyes staring back. "This is no relic," Poirot said, his voice sharp with realization. "This photograph is recent." Georgina's face drained of color, as she took it from him, the room around her spinning. "That can't be possible," she whispered. "He vanished. He was never seen again." Poirot's eyes were cold, focused. The man who vanished might never have left at all. He may have been hiding here, in plain sight, waiting to be found. Hastings frowned, unsure what to make of it. "You think he's still here?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Poirot flipped the photograph over. On the back was a scrawled note, taken outside the Drowned Fox, 1937. The name echoed through the room like a bell, tolling in the distance. "The Drowned Fox," Georgina murmured, her voice shaking. "That's a pub in Murchley Hollow. It's been closed for years, burned down long ago." Poirot tucked the photograph into his pocket, his eyes sharp with purpose. "Then we must go to Merchley Hollow," he said, his tone brokering no argument. "Whoever left this wanted it found. Whoever took this photo knew something. And what they knew is that Alistair Lawton didn't disappear at all. He's been here all along, watching, waiting." As they made their way to the ruined pub, the air seemed to thicken with secrets long buried, and Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, waiting for them to uncover what had been hidden in the ashes of the past. Something was stirring in the garden, something that had been buried too long to stay silent much longer. The remains of the Drowned Fox pub stood like a decaying monument, its once vibrant presence now reduced to mere shadows, swallowed by the relentless grip of time. The cracked flagstones beneath their feet were uneven, half covered by stubborn weeds, pushing through the cracks as if the earth itself refused to let go. The air was thick with the scent of rot, mingled with the faintest trace of old smoke, as though the building still carried the ghosts of its fiery past. From somewhere deep within the ruins, the wind whispered softly, carrying secrets that had long been buried and forgotten. A figure appeared from the shadows, a man in his 60s, stooped under the weight of years, wearing a heavy coat and a flat cap that seemed to have seen better days. His eyes, however, were sharp, and they seemed to carry the weight of every stone, every beam of this place. Ernest Rowley. He stood there, leaning heavily on a walking stick, the harsh lines of his face a map of the years spent watching this place fall apart. His voice, gruff and raw, broke the eerie silence. "You're not from around here," he rasped, his gaze fixed on Poirot and Hastings as they approached. Poirot, ever the picture of politeness, tipped his hat slightly, his gaze never leaving Rowley. "That is correct, monsieur. I am Hercule Poirot, and this is Captain Hastings." Rowley's lips twitched into something like a smile, but it quickly faded as he looked back at the wreckage. "Used to run the place," he muttered, almost to himself, "before it burned down. Insurance never came through, so now I just keep an eye on it. Old habit, I suppose." Poirot's sharp eyes never wavered from him. "Before that, did you know a man named Alistair Lawton?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was a keen intensity beneath it. Rowley's face froze at the name, as though the word itself had physical weight. "Lawton," he repeated, the name sounding bitter in his mouth. I remember him. Tall, lean, always dressed like a solicitor, but drank like a fisherman. He didn't go by that name here, though." Rowley paused, eyes narrowing as he recollected. "He called himself Martin Clark, paid in cash, kept to himself, played chess alone in the corner, always asking questions that no one had answers to." Poirot leaned in, his interest piqued. "And then?" Rowley scratched his beard, eyes distant, lost in thought. "He disappeared. Just walked out one night, and never came back. I told the constable, but there was no record of him. I figured he skipped town, found a new life somewhere else." Poirot's gaze didn't leave him, his mind working behind those calculating eyes. "Did he receive visitors?" he asked, his voice even. Rowley nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as memories stirred. "One woman, properly dressed, always. Came twice. First time they argued. Loud. Second time, she left in tears. Never saw her again after that." Poirot's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something passing through them. "Can you describe her?" Rowley's face tightened as he considered. Blonde, well kept, looked to be in her mid-30s. Might have been his sister, or something more. Poirot absorbed the information quietly, his mind turning over the new details. He turned away and looked toward the remains of the pub, his voice soft but insistent. "May we look inside?" Rowley hesitated, then shrugged. "Be my guest. But watch your step. The floor's gone, half of it." The three of them made their way into the wreckage through the back door. The floor beneath their feet was littered with shards of glass, twisted metal, and charred remnants of the building's former life. Hastings grimaced at the sight, carefully stepping over the debris, his eyes scanning the blackened beams above, which sagged dangerously. The stench of smoke and rot was suffocating, and the air felt heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. Poirot, however, moved with a calm precision, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He wandered through the ruins, examining every inch of the space, as though it held the key to a puzzle only he could solve. Then, near the base of the fireplace, something caught Poirot's attention. He bent down, his gloved hands carefully pulling out a charred remnant of wood, a flat rectangular object, partially preserved under a fallen beam. As he wiped the soot away, it became clear that it was the back of a photo frame. The name card, half burnt but still legible, read Aza Martin. Poirot's lips parted slightly as he studied the card, his voice barely above a whisper. The initials from the letter Georgina received. Hastings' eyes widened in realization. So it was him. Alistair Lawton, using an alias. Poirot's gaze hardened, his mind racing through the implications. But now we must ask, who sent the letter to Miss Lawton? And why after all these years? The question hung in the air, unanswered. As Poirot turned his attention back to the ruins, he moved further into the room, his eyes drawn to a rusted filing cabinet, pushed haphazardly against the far wall. The drawer was slightly ajar, and as Poirot pulled it open, the contents revealed themselves, damp, scorched but still holding secrets. His fingers sifted through the remains, finding something curious. A matchbox, its crest embossed with a symbol he recognized. A fox and an hourglass, crossed beneath a crowned letter, D. Poirot's gaze lingered on the matchbox, as recognition flickered in his eyes. I've seen this before, he muttered to himself, slipping the matchbox into his pocket. He turned toward Rowley, who had been waiting outside, watching them through the window. Did Mr. Clark ever speak of Dorrington? Poirot asked, his voice low and deliberate. Rowley's expression darkened, the lines of his face tightening, as he recalled the conversation. "Aye," he said, his voice distant. He mentioned something about being driven out of a house that ticked too loud. Never could understand what he meant by that. Poirot's mind whirred as he processed this new piece of information. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but the puzzle was far from solved. There was something deeper here, something hidden beneath the ashes, waiting to be uncovered. The faintest echo of a man who had vanished, and yet perhaps never truly left, began to pulse in Poirot's mind. The ticking of time, faint but persistent, seemed to grow louder, counting down to the next revelation. And Poirot knew with a deep certainty that this was only the beginning. The crumbling remains of the drowned Fox pub loomed ominously in the fading light, its broken sign creaking faintly, as if it too remembered something long forgotten. Poirot paused beneath it, his sharp eyes flicking to the darkening sky, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. It means something, he murmured softly, almost to himself. A place where guilt is not just a memory, but a presence that clings to the walls, echoing louder than time itself. The words hung in the air, their meaning settling into the depths of his mind as he turned away, his face set with a quiet resolve. By the time he and Hastings returned to Dorrington Chase, the sky had deepened into a bruised purple, the air thick with the kind of tension that seemed to seep from the very bricks of the house. Inside, the ticking of the countless clocks seemed to grow louder, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Georgina Lawton stood in the drawing-room, her posture rigid, a careful mask of composure hiding the turmoil beneath. "You were gone quite some time," she said, her voice measured, betraying no emotion as Poirot entered. "Did you find something at the pub?" Poirot's gaze never wavered from hers, as he placed the half-burnt photo frame and the weathered matchbox on the table. "Mademoiselle, I discovered more than I anticipated," he said, his voice low but firm. "Your cousin Alistair did not vanish as you believed. He changed his name, lived quietly in Merchley Hollow for a time, until he disappeared again." Georgina's eyes flicked to the items, but her expression remained unchanged, almost unreadable. "And you believe someone is trying to reveal this now after all these years?" she asked, her voice calm, though the faintest trace of something, perhaps fear, shimmered in her gaze. Poirot nodded slowly, his mind already piecing together the fragments. "Indeed, but the question remains, who and why?" After 2 decades of silence, he turned to Hastings, his expression determined. "Mon ami, I would like you to speak with Dr. Puick. Obtain a list of visitors and emergency reports from the summer of Alistair's disappearance." Hastings gave a quick nod, eager to be of use, and made his way toward the door, a sense of purpose to his movements. Poirot, however, remained fixed on Georgina. "Mademoiselle, may I see Alistair's old room?" There was a fleeting hesitation in her eyes, but she nodded curtly. "It's up the east wing, 2nd floor. No one has touched it in years." Poirot ascended the staircase slowly, his hand resting lightly on the cold, worn railing. The air grew colder as he moved through the east wing, the shadows creeping closer, as if the house itself was conspiring against him. The corridor ended in a simple wooden door, and as Poirot turned the handle, the room beyond was revealed. A modest space, untouched by time, save for the dust that clung to every surface. The room was stark, its simplicity almost unsettling. A single bed with a faded quilt, a wardrobe with a tarnished mirror, and a writing desk, its surface cluttered with forgotten objects. Poirot's eyes took in every detail, each element whispering secrets that had been buried here. He opened the wardrobe first, finding it empty save for a moth-eaten scarf, hanging forlornly on a solitary hanger. Beneath the bed, only cobwebs clung to the forgotten corners, but it was the desk that drew Poirot's attention. He slid open the drawer with careful precision, and found a book, a journal. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still legible. Alistair's neat, sharp script, each letter deliberate and almost mathematical. Most of the entries were mundane, weather patterns, chess scores, observations on daily life, but one entry, dated July 16th, stood out like a flare in the dark. She came again. This time she brought photographs, proof of what they did. "I think she's afraid, but she's clever. More clever than I ever gave her credit for. She wants me to come forward, but if I do, it's not just Lionel who will hang. It will destroy the whole house. The clocks will stop. Perhaps that's what she wants." She wore blue today. Strange how some colors stay in the mind. Poirot's mind raced as he closed the journal, his brow furrowed in concentration. He left the room quickly, descending the stairs where Georgina was now conversing with Mrs. Fell, the housekeeper. He waited patiently, allowing the conversation to conclude before turning to Georgina. "Mademoiselle, was there ever a woman in your cousin's life? Someone who wore blue?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, but she recovered quickly, blinking at him. "Blue? That's an odd question to ask," she replied, though a slight hesitation lingered in her voice. Poirot pressed on, his gaze unyielding. Not if she visited him shortly before he disappeared. Someone who may have brought photographs. Georgina's expression shifted, and she seemed to ponder the question before answering slowly. There was someone, Beatrice Denham. She lived across the road. Her father owned the Denham Shipping Company, Alistair, and she had a complicated friendship. Poirot's eyes flicked sharply to hers, sensing the weight behind her words. "Complicated," he pressed. She took a breath, her voice lowering. "They were close, very close, but my father disapproved. He said she was manipulative, obsessed with something." Her words trailed off, leaving a hollow silence in their wake, but Poirot's mind was already working, the pieces falling into place. Something about this woman, something about these photographs, and the connection to a house of clocks. All of it pointed toward a truth buried far deeper than anyone had yet imagined. The mystery had only just begun to unravel, but the ticking of the clocks was growing louder. As the mist rolled across Dorrington Chase the next morning, a palpable heaviness hung in the air, the land shrouded in an eerie quiet that seemed to press against the walls of the manor. The crisp chill in the air only added to the sense of foreboding that had taken root within the house. Poirot, His coat dark against the pale light spilling in through the window, stood in the drawing room, his gaze fixed on the obscured fields outside, as if the landscape itself was hiding something just beyond his reach. Behind him, the grandfather clock ticked methodically, its rhythm oddly deliberate, almost too aware of its own passage of time, as though it had been waiting for something, someone. Hastings, flipping through the morning paper, glanced up at Poirot's observation, his expression unreadable. "Have you noticed?" Poirot's voice cut through the silence, softer than a whisper, but filled with an undeniable weight. "The house has grown quieter since we returned." Hastings' brow furrowed in confusion, and he shifted in his seat, his voice dismissive as he set the paper down. "You mean the chiming last night?" The clock struck only 12. He shrugged, leaning back. Perhaps the mechanism just corrected itself. But Poirot's eyes gleamed with a knowing look, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "Clocks do not correct themselves, Monomi. They obey their masters." Just as he spoke, the shrill sound of the doorbell cut through the thick atmosphere, its 3 sharp chimes reverberating through the house, as though summoning an unwanted visitor. Mrs. Fell opened the door to reveal an elderly man, his coat worn and frayed, a cap stained with oil, his walk uneven with a pronounced limp. The leather case he carried seemed almost to weigh him down, and his wire spectacles glinted in the dim light as he took careful steps into the foyer. "Ah, Mr. de Velen," Poirot greeted him, stepping forward with a polite but measured air. "You were the clockmaker for this household, were you not?" The man nodded, his movement slow, but deliberate. "Been servicing the Lawton clocks since 1924, Mr. Poirot." His voice rasped like dry leaves underfoot. "Miss Lawton said you had questions." Poirot gestured toward the hallway, where the endless procession of clocks stood like sentinels, their ticking the only sound that had dared to break the heavy silence. "I have many questions, Monsieur de Velen," Poirot said, his gaze never leaving the elderly man's weathered face. "But let us begin with this one." He pointed to the tall, imposing grandfather clock that had been struck by 13 chimes the previous night. De Velen shuffled forward, squinting as he studied the clock with a knowing eye. "This is an excellent piece," he murmured, brushing a hand along the wood. "French, 19th century, but someone has tampered with it." His voice was soft but urgent, as though the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. Poirot's interest piqued. "Go on," he urged. The old clockmaker adjusted his spectacles and leaned in, his breath fogging up the glass of the clock's casing. "There's a tiny switch here," he said, pointing to a barely visible lever on the side. "Only someone who knows what they're looking for would see it. If you slide it, the mechanism adds an extra strike. One more chime. A ghost strike. Like the 13th chime last night." Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity obvious. "You mean the 13th chime was deliberate?" De Velen nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Built in, but not part of the original design. Someone wanted it to be heard. A message." The words hung in the air between them, as heavy and foreboding as the mist outside, carrying with them the dark weight of a long-buried secret. A secret now set in motion after 20 years. Poirot's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place, his thoughts moving faster than the hands of the very clock that had been tampered with. The woman in blue, the photographs, the old connections. Something was being manipulated from the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before the full truth would be revealed. The clock, it seemed, had spoken, but its message had only just begun to unfold. Poirot's gaze was razor-sharp as he turned back to de Velen, his voice measured but laced with curiosity. "And who, monsieur, would possess the knowledge to make such a change?" De Velen's frown deepened, and his eyes darted nervously, as though the answer was just out of reach. He scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Only someone with precise training," he muttered slowly, his voice rough. "Perhaps someone who worked closely with me, or someone taught by Alistair Lawton." Poirot's expression remained calm, but his mind began to race, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. "Alistair, you say? A man brilliant with his hands?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "Yes," de Velen answered, a deep respect in his voice, despite the tension that had crept into his words. He apprenticed with me for a year when he was just 16. Obsessive, almost fanatical about precision. Every detail, every movement, had to be perfect. But after that, he left, and no one heard from him until... Devlin paused, discomfort clouding his features. Poirot leaned in, the faintest glimmer of interest in his eyes. Did he ever return after he left? Devlin hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously toward the door, as though expecting someone to walk in. Once, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He came back, a quiet visit. He asked about specialty components, paid me in cash, and gave me a design for a chambered delay circuit for a mantel clock. Told me not to mention it to anyone. No one. Not a word. Poirot's expression sharpened, sensing there was more beneath the surface. When was this? He asked, his tone barely changing. Devlin scratched at his beard, his brow furrowing as he racked his memory. 2 months before he disappeared, he said, a flicker of unease passing over his face. Poirot, his mind racing with possibilities, nodded thoughtfully. So he planned something, he murmured, more to himself than to Devlin. The clockmaker looked uneasy. Yes, but he was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder as though someone was following him. Poirot's eyes glinted with a deeper understanding, and he began to pace, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the back of his chair, as he processed the new information. Tell me, monsieur, have you ever seen this crest? Poirot asked suddenly, pulling out the burned matchbox from the drowned fox, his gaze never leaving Devlin's face. Devlin squinted at it, his face registering recognition. That's Denim Shipping, the old family crest, from the house across the road, he said, his voice laced with surprise. Poirot's lips twitched into a small calculating smile. Merci, monsieur, you've been most helpful. After Devlin left, Poirot turned to Hastings, his gaze now sharper, his mind racing as he pieced together the intricate web of connections. You see it now, don't you? Poirot asked, his voice dropping slightly, his words heavy with meaning. Hastings shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed in confusion. I see something, he said slowly, but I'm not sure I understand it. Poirot lifted the matchbox again, his fingers turning it over delicately in his hand, as if examining it for hidden truths. This item, Poirot began, his voice quiet but intense, links Allister to the Denim family. The clock modification. This wasn't an accident, Hastings. It was meant to disturb, to warn, and whoever did this wanted to be noticed. Georgina. His voice trailed off as he glanced over at Hastings, his eyes piercing. She says nothing, but she has rehearsed every word she speaks. Do you believe she's lying? Hastings hesitated, his thoughts whirling. I'm not sure, he said, his voice uncertain. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, and his voice softened with quiet intensity. No, Hastings, I believe she is concealing something, and that, my friend, is where the difference lies. He turned toward the staircase, his gaze unfocused as he thought of the next step. We must speak to Beatrice Denim. Hastings raised an eyebrow, a tinge of disbelief in his voice. But we don't know where she is. Poirot's eyes were cold as steel as he met his companion's gaze. No, but someone does, and I believe that someone is preparing for our next visit. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper. But first we must speak to the vicar. Hastings blinked in confusion. The vicar. Poirot nodded once, his expression inscrutable. In villages like these, mon ami, the vicar always knows what the gossip dares not say aloud. Reverend Lionel Harrove, the vicar of St. Jude's Parish, had served in Dorrington for 37 years. A tall, wiry man with a fringe of white hair and watery blue eyes. He greeted Poirot and Hastings in the vicarage library with mild confusion. Terribly sorry, gentlemen, he said, settling into a worn chair. I'm not sure how I can be of assistance. Poirot sat across from him, his posture impeccable, his presence commanding. You were here during the summer Allister Lawton disappeared. Yes, the vicar nodded, adjusting his spectacles. Indeed, I conducted the prayers during the search vigil. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And did you ever counsel a young woman, perhaps one in distress, who may have visited Allister before he vanished? Reverend Harrove shifted in his chair, his expression growing more uneasy. Well, there was Miss Denim. She came to me the week after. She seemed frightened. Said she'd done something terrible. But wouldn't say what. Poirot's eyes sharpened, sensing that this could be the breakthrough they needed. Did she leave a confession? He pressed. The vicar's voice softened, almost as if the memory itself pained him. She asked me to burn it after reading, he said, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. But I remember every word. Poirot's breath caught in his chest as he leaned forward. His curiosity piqued. Then please, monsieur, tell me what she said. Harrow's voice dropped to a near whisper, his hands trembling slightly as he recalled the conversation. She said, I tried to stop it. I gave him the photographs. I told him everything. But it wasn't enough. Someone else was watching. Someone in the house. The room seemed to grow colder as those words hung in the air, the weight of them almost too much to bear. Poirot stood slowly, his face a mask of determination, his eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. My monsieur, that is precisely what I needed to hear, he said quietly, his voice calm but tinged with the intensity of what lay ahead. The wind outside rattled the windows of Dorrington Chase, as though it too was aware of the storm that was coming closer, ever closer, like the shadow of a truth waiting to be uncovered. And Poirot knew, with certainty, that the next step would bring them face to face with whatever lay hidden beneath the surface. The game was shifting, and they were no longer just investigating a disappearance. They were walking into the heart of something much darker. The wind howled through the trees, as if urging the secrets of the past to rise from the shadows, pressing against the glass like an unseen force coaxing them to whisper. The sky had darkened into a deep shade of violet, the hour just before twilight, when the village seemed to hold its breath in a strange stillness. Inside the parlor, Georgina Lawton sat with her back to the fire, her fingers tracing the edges of a letter by the dim candlelight. The quiet creak of the door disturbed the silence, and she glanced up, her gaze cool and guarded. Back so soon? She asked, her voice laced with brittle politeness, but there was something about the way she spoke that made it clear she was hiding something. Poirot stepped forward, offering a slight bow, his presence calm yet assertive. The vicar was most obliging, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Georgina's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the paper, and Poirot's gaze sharpened, sensing the shift in the air. Taking a deliberate step closer, he folded his hands behind his back, his tones soft but penetrating. Mademoiselle, he began, his voice smooth as silk, when you last saw Alistair, was there anyone else present in the house? She blinked, her eyes flickering momentarily before she answered, No, only myself. Her voice held a tremor, but she quickly masked it with a brittle calm. Poirot's eyes narrowed, studying her with a quiet intensity. Are you sure? He asked, his tone now more pointed, his question lingering in the air like a thread tugging at a delicate weave. Georgina hesitated, her gaze faltering as she glanced down at the letter in her hands. I was under the impression we were alone, she muttered. But there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a fleeting crack in her composed facade. Poirot's expression remained kind, but his words cut through the tension. Miss Denham believed otherwise. The mention of the name struck its mark, and Georgina's fingers went rigid around the letter, her lips parting slightly as her eyes dropped to the paper in her lap. She's still alive. Poirot's voice was soft, but the weight of his words hung in the room. Georgina carefully folded the letter, hiding it away in a drawer as though the very act of concealing it would erase the past. She turned to face him once more, her voice quieter now, barely above a whisper. She came to the house, she said slowly, her words strained. Twice. Her eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, the facade of politeness cracked. My father disliked her intensely, said she was dangerous. Poirot tilted his head, his gaze never leaving hers. Why dangerous? He asked, his voice a low murmur, coaxing her to reveal more. Georgina walked slowly toward the fireplace, her back turned to him as she stared into the flames, her face obscured. She had secrets, she said at last, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken truths. About Alistair, and about Lionel. She hesitated, as though the words pained her to say. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. But Poirot could see the internal struggle in her, the way she was unraveling before him. But you knew something was amiss. He pressed gently. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Alistair had documents, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Family letters, old ledgers, things that hinted at misdeeds, business dealings from my grandfather's era. He said they were proof of criminal transactions. Fraud. Worse. Poirot's brow furrowed, his mind racing as he absorbed the new information. Did he ever confront your father with them? He asked, his voice steady, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of urgency. Georgina nodded, her eyes distant. Yes, she replied, her voice tinged with a memory that seemed to haunt her. That very night, they argued loudly. I was in my room, and I remember the silence that followed. Her voice faltered, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Poirot's voice softened as he continued. And then, she looked at him, her face pale as she recalled the moment. I found the study door ajar, she whispered. My father was inside, alone. Alistair was gone. Her voice trailed off as though the rest of the memory was too painful to revisit. He said Alistair had left in a rage, she added, her voice distant, that he had packed a bag and stormed off. She hesitated before continuing. I believed him. But the bag. Her eyes flickered and Poirot felt the weight of the unspoken words. It's still upstairs, she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the upper floor. Poirot gave a slow, deliberate nod, his mind piecing together the fragments of the story. And yet you never called the police, he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. Georgina looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting in her lap. I was afraid, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I had always obeyed my father. He had a way of making disobedience feel like betrayal. The room fell into a heavy silence, and just then a sound echoed through the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. The rhythm was unnaturally fast, each tick louder than the last. Hastings turned sharply, his brow furrowed in confusion. That's not the grandfather clock, he muttered, his eyes scanning the room. It's faster. They followed the sound down the narrow corridor, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. At the far end, a staircase wound upward toward the attic. Georgina hesitated at the foot of the stairs, her face pale, but Poirot pressed on, his steps sure and purposeful. The door at the top of the stairs had not been opened in years, and the air around it seemed thick with the weight of forgotten things. Poirot stepped inside first, his eyes quickly taking in the cluttered attic. Trunks, broken furniture, and sheets draped over objects that seemed to belong to another time. Near the window stood a narrow wooden clock, tall and slender, its ticking disturbingly fast. Poirot knelt beside it, his hands steady as he opened the casing. Inside there was a second compartment, but it was empty. The dust was disturbed, and the ticking accelerated deliberately so. Someone has been here recently, Poirot murmured, his voice low and contemplative. Hastings glanced around, his gaze settling on the empty compartment. You think this is where Alistair hid the documents? He asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Poirot stood slowly, brushing the dust from his knees, as he surveyed the attic with a knowing look. I do, he said quietly. And someone has removed them. His eyes darkened with an unspoken realization. And I believe that someone still watches. The wind howled fiercely through the trees, its shrill cry tugging at the edges of the night, as though the air itself was trying to tear open the secrets that lay buried within the house. Georgina's face paled, her eyes wide with disbelief as she looked at Poirot, his sharp gaze never leaving her. That's impossible, she whispered, the words slipping from her lips with a quiet tremor. I lock everything. Every night. Poirot's expression remained unreadable as he turned toward her, his voice calm, though there was a steel edge to it. Is there another entrance? Her lips parted slightly, as if the very idea of this hidden door was an affront to her memory. A cellar door, she replied, her voice barely audible, as if even speaking of it would bring something terrible into the world. Behind the orchard hedge. It hasn't been used in years. Poirot's face betrayed no surprise, only a quiet understanding, and he nodded once, motioning for them to follow him. They made their way outside, the air thick with an unnatural chill, the wind bending the apple trees and sending leaves scattering like forgotten whispers. Behind the thick tangle of brambles, a small wooden hatch lay hidden, its iron hinges rusted and creaking in protest. As Poirot pulled it open, the smell of damp earth filling the air. Below, a narrow staircase wound into the darkness, the kind of place where secrets would gladly fester. Poirot lit a torch and led the way, Hastings and Georgina following close behind. The air in the cellar was thick with the scent of stone and old earth, the place eerily still save for the faint creak of the old timbers above them. As they moved deeper into the shadows, Hastings' sharp eyes caught sight of something scratches, fresh ones on the far wall, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor. Footprints, Hastings murmured, pointing to the corner. Poirot crouched beside them, studying the marks with an intensity that seemed to cut through the dark. Boot size 11, with the same heel imprint as before, he observed, rising to his feet slowly, a grim look crossing his features. "We are not dealing with memories, madame. Someone is still entering this house." The words hung in the air like a spell, and Georgina's face drained of color. She swayed slightly, and Poirot steadied her with a gentle but firm grip. "Tell me the truth," he asked softly. "Did your father kill Alistair?" Her eyes welled up, and she faltered. "I don't know," she whispered, the tears threatening to spill over. "I never saw him. Never saw a body. But I remember my father burning papers. That same night." Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Then perhaps Alistair never left this house at all." "Not truly." He gazed upward toward the ceiling, as if the answers were hidden there. "And if he didn't," he continued, "then I fear we may yet find his remains within these walls." The words seemed to freeze the very air around them, and Hastings felt the weight of the moment, the creeping certainty that they were on the verge of uncovering something terrible, something buried long ago. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that the truth, whatever it may be, was about to emerge from the depths. They returned to the library, where Poirot sat with a notebook open before him, pen in hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Hastings remained silent, watching his friend piece together a puzzle only he could see. The evening stretched on in heavy silence, the clocks ticking with a muted, almost reluctant rhythm, as if time itself were unwilling to continue. Finally, Poirot spoke, his voice low, thoughtful. "Hastings, tell me, what does one do when one is not strong enough to commit murder, but too afraid to reveal the truth?" Hastings blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I suppose one hides the truth." Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Exactly," he said softly. "And what is the most dreadful truth to hide?" Hastings opened his mouth but paused, as the chilling weight of Poirot's words settled over him. "The body," Poirot said with quiet finality. "I believe that Alistair Lawton never left this house. Not alive. And perhaps not dead either." Hastings swallowed, his heart hammering in his chest. "You think he's buried here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Poirot stood, his movements deliberate. "I think," he said, his voice steady with certainty, "he is close, very close." They went first to the study, the sanctum of Lionel Lawton, where Poirot knelt beside the hearth, his fingers tracing the edge of a rug with careful precision. "Notice," he said, lifting the corner of the rug, "the wood beneath is stained unevenly. And here," he pressed down on a section of the floor, "it gives slightly." He retrieved a small penknife from his coat, and began prying gently at the edges. With a soft creak, a section of the board lifted, revealing the faint musty smell of something forgotten, something ancient. As the floorboard came free, the darkness beneath it seemed to breathe, waiting for them to uncover what had been hidden there all this time. Poirot stood in the silence of the dimly lit study, the walls heavy with secrets, his eyes fixed on the floorboards beneath his feet. Hastings stood close by, his gaze shifting nervously between Poirot and the scattered remnants of a life long gone. They had found nothing but dust and decay in the cellar, Yet there was something more to the house. A pulse. A presence that refused to be ignored. After their fruitless search for the remains of Alcester, it was the locket that had caught their attention. A faded photograph enclosed within. The image of a younger Alcester, beaming beside a woman in a blue coat. Poirot's voice had been low, his tone somber as he muttered her name. Beatrice. She had left something behind, he had said. And now, as he lifted the leather pouch from beneath the floorboards, Hastings watched, his pulse quickening with each slow, deliberate movement. Inside the pouch were papers, old, crumbling, yet crucial, shipping records, falsified ledgers, names of clients who had paid with dirty money. Alcester had discovered the truth, had planned to expose it, but someone had silenced him, and someone else had been desperately searching for these very papers ever since. Poirot's mind raced as he pieced the puzzle together. This was not just about business, it was a conspiracy, a web of lies that twisted around the very heart of the Lawton and Denham families. As they made their way to the Denham estate, the atmosphere thickened with tension. The housekeeper, a woman who seemed as ancient as the house itself, led them to Beatrice Denham. She descended the staircase like a shadow from another era, her eyes clouded with regret. When questioned, she revealed her own part in the story, a hesitant witness to Alcester's desperate pursuit of justice. But even she had been too afraid to speak out, too loyal to a family whose name was stained with blood and deceit. "I warned him," Beatrice confessed, her voice cracking. "I told him to stay away, to let it go, but he couldn't. And now it's all coming back." Her hand trembled as she took the photograph from Poirot, her fingers brushing against the edges of the locket. "Do you think Georgina knew?" Beatrice asked, her eyes pleading for answers. Poirot didn't respond immediately. He simply handed her the photo, and gave a faint, understanding nod. "She knew in her own way," he said softly. "But fear has a way of clouding even the clearest of minds." As they departed, Hastings glanced back, his thoughts swirling with unanswered questions. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Poirot's lips curled into a subtle smile, but it was a smile that held no warmth. "Now," he said, "we wait, because I believe the one who fears exposure the most is already preparing to act again." The night settled over Dorrington Chase like a suffocating fog, its oppressive weight casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The clocks inside the house, ever reliable, ticked away with their usual precision. But tonight, their sound felt different, sharper, more deliberate, as though they were counting down to an inevitable moment. Poirot stood in the drawing room, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on the smaller clock next to the grandfather one, its brass gears ticking in a rhythm that felt almost unnatural. Hastings, adjusting his collar with a nervous twitch, asked, "Are you sure this will work?" His voice, though quiet, betrayed a hint of doubt. Poirot's gaze flicked to him, his expression calm and unyielding. "I am certain, Hastings. The one who enters tonight is not here by chance. They seek what has been hidden, and once they find it, they will reveal themselves." The words hung in the air like a promise. Georgina had agreed to remain in her room, the weight of the house's secrets pressing down on her with suffocating force. She had confessed her unease earlier, her voice trembling. "I can't bear the thought of someone moving through this house, hiding in the shadows, knowing what's been kept from me." Poirot had reassured her gently, his tone a soft balm to her anxiety. "You will not be alone, mademoiselle. I will ensure no harm comes to you tonight. We are playing a game of observation. The truth will come." They had prepared the house with meticulous care, locking every door except for one, the back cellar door, the one through which their mysterious visitor had slipped the night before. Poirot's lips curled into a subtle smile, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He motioned for Hastings to follow, and they moved down the hall, each step measured and quiet. As they approached the door to the garden and the cellar, Poirot stopped, his body rigid. The seconds seemed to stretch, the house holding its breath along with them. Then a faint click, A sound so soft, so small, yet unmistakable. The cellar door creaked open. Poirot's eyes sparked with determination. "It begins," he whispered. They moved forward, each step soundless as they neared the entrance. Poirot gestured for Hastings to stay back, creeping toward the door with the quiet precision of a predator. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible beyond it. Poirot reached out, his hand steady as he pushed the door open wider, the dim light from the hallway spilling into the cellar, illuminating just enough for him to see the figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Dressed in a long coat, their face hidden by the deep hood of a dark cloak, they stood motionless, waiting. The figure moved swiftly, their every step calculated, as though they could feel the weight of eyes upon them, though none were visible. Poirot remained as still as stone, his heart steady, his mind calculating every shift in the air. The figure approached the staircase that led down to the lower rooms, completely unaware that Poirot and Hastings were no more than a breath away. Poirot raised a finger to his lips, signaling Hastings to remain silent, and they crept forward, their movements as ghostly as the shadows surrounding them. They descended into the cellar, where the cool, musty air clung to their skin, the smell of aged wood and forgotten dust thick in the air. At the far end of the room, the figure paused, their eyes flicking nervously, as though sensing an unseen presence, unsure of who might be watching. Poirot moved closer, his steps light, his breath almost inaudible. The figure reached into their coat, and withdrew a small object, a key. The figure held it for a long moment, staring at it as if contemplating its significance, before slipping it into a hidden lock in the floorboards. The sound of the lock clicking open was barely perceptible, but to Poirot, it was deafening. His heart quickened as the figure kneeled, lifting the floorboard with practiced ease, and retrieved something from within, something wrapped in brown cloth, perhaps a bundle of papers, or something more. But Poirot's attention wasn't on the object. His eyes were fixated on the gloves the figure wore, fingers covered, but the wrists exposed, revealing an old scar that ran across the left wrist. Poirot had seen that scar before. Without warning, Poirot stepped forward, his voice steady, yet filled with the weight of a revelation. "Madame Beatrice Denham," he said, and the figure froze. A gasp escaped her lips as she slowly turned, eyes wide in shock. How did you?" she stammered, but the words faltered in her throat. Poirot, with unshaken calmness, held up the photograph he had uncovered earlier, the one showing Beatrice standing next to Alistair. "The game is up," he said simply. Beatrice's face twisted in disbelief, but there was no escape now. "You were not clever enough, mademoiselle," Poirot continued, his gaze unyielding. "You underestimated one thing, the clocks. They are not mere witnesses to time, but to secrets. Your secret." The room seemed to grow colder, the ticking of the clocks above them more insistent, as if echoing the truth that had been buried for so long. Beatrice's face tightened as the truth of her actions began to settle over her like a shroud. Alistair Lawton did not disappear. Poirot's voice was a quiet storm. "He had a plan. You knew that. You tried to stop him, didn't you? You couldn't allow those ledgers to come to light, couldn't let your father's name be ruined." Beatrice trembled, her lips parted, but offering no defense. Poirot stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You thought you could erase him, just as you thought you could erase the truth. But you can't hide forever, mademoiselle. Not from me, and certainly not from the clocks." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her, but her hands were shaking, the bundle of papers in her grip tight enough to turn her knuckles white. The silence between them stretched thin, the ticking of the clocks, now louder than ever, filling the void. "You were right to fear the clocks," Poirot continued, his tone soft but unyielding. "They know everything, and tonight they have told me everything." Beatrice's eyes darted from the photograph to the cellar door, then back to the floorboards, her hands trembling as she clutched the papers. The room seemed to close in on her, and for the first time, The weight of her lies felt unbearable. Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered. As he stood at the threshold of the room, the tension in the air thick with secrets waiting to be unveiled. Beatrice Denham's face had drained of color, her breathing quickening, as if the walls of the house were closing in on her. The sound of the ticking clocks overhead, once a distant murmur, now seemed to grow louder, a heartbeat that mirrored the rising intensity of the moment. Poirot stepped closer, his voice a calm yet deadly whisper. "You thought you could bury it all, didn't you? The truth, the lies, the betrayal. But you were never going to escape, not from me, and not from the clocks. They've witnessed everything, and tonight they will speak." Beatrice recoiled slightly, the papers clutched tightly in her trembling hands, a thin sheen of sweat glistening on her brow. She struggled to find words, but only silence filled the space. Poirot continued, his voice cold but filled with a hint of pity. "Alistair Lawton didn't just vanish, did he? You knew what he had, what he could expose. That's why you killed him, to protect your own skin, your father's name, and the legacy of deceit you've spent years building." Beatrice's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. Poirot pressed on, his eyes narrowing as he observed the marks on her hands, the faint remnants of guilt and fear she couldn't quite hide. "You protected yourself, not your father," he said softly, his words sinking deep. "And now, even the very thing you tried to conceal has come back to haunt you." Her chest heaved with the weight of the revelation, her mind scrambling for a defense she no longer had. "I had no choice," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I had to protect everything. My father, our business, everything we've built." Poirot tilted his head, as if considering her words carefully, before replying with a knowing look. "And in doing so, you've condemned yourself. But it's not too late to face the truth. The clocks have already told me everything I need to know." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle before he turned, his gaze flickering toward the staircase. The door to Georgina's room creaked open slowly, and there, standing in the doorway, was the last person Poirot expected to see. Lionel Lawton, his face pale and drawn, yet undeniably alive. Beatrice gasped, her eyes widening with shock and disbelief, as she took a step back, her mind unable to process the impossibility of the moment. How are you?" she stammered, her voice trailing off. Lionel's gaze met hers, a mixture of sorrow and defiance in his eyes as he spoke in a voice that seemed foreign, weak but resolute. "I never wanted to harm anyone, Beatrice. But you." He stepped forward, his words heavy with the weight of years of deception. "You left me no choice. You pushed me to this. You thought you could bury the truth forever. But now it's too late." Alistair was close, too close to exposing everything. If he had gone public, it would have destroyed us all. My company, my reputation, everything. The revelation hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Beatrice, her face frozen in a mix of horror and disbelief, slowly raised a hand to her mouth as the truth she had tried so hard to suppress finally came crashing down around her. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken confessions, and the clocks, those silent witnesses to every secret, seemed to tick louder, as though urging the truth to be set free. The atmosphere in the room was thick, suffocating under the weight of long-buried secrets, now finally clawing their way to the surface. Lionel Lawton, once a powerful and imposing figure in his family's life, now stood crumbled, diminished in the face of the truth that had come to light. He avoided the sharp, probing gaze of Hercule Poirot, his eyes downcast, unable to meet the eyes of the man who had unraveled all the lies he had lived with for years. His voice, once commanding, now trembled as he spoke, his words filled with a sense of guilt that seemed too heavy for him to bear. "I never meant to drag anyone into this. I thought if I disappeared, if I cut myself off from everything, I could escape the past, fade away. But I was wrong." Poirot, as always, stood calm and collected, a quiet yet unyielding presence. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Lionel's, his words sharp and cutting. "You hid yourself, monsieur, not to escape, but to protect the web of lies you had carefully woven. You used your daughter Georgina as a shield, letting her love and loyalty keep your secret safe for all these years." Lionel's gaze fell to the floor, his face crumpling with shame. Yes, I thought if I stayed away long enough, if I let everyone believe I was dead, the lies would fade, that the weight would lift. But it didn't work that way. The lies only grew. And now, his voice faltered, the finality of the moment settling in like a heavy burden. Poirot's attention shifted to Georgina, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face as pale as death itself. Her mind seemed to be racing, unable to process the monstrous truth unfolding before her. "Your father never left this house, mademoiselle." Poirot's voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "He remained here, hiding in plain sight." His deception lasted far longer than anyone could have imagined. But tonight, it ends. Lionel's voice cracked as he spoke again, his eyes welling with tears. "I never wanted this for you, Georgina. I never wanted you to be a part of this. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." His words trailed off, the silence between them growing more unbearable by the second. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the ticking echoing in the room as if it was counting down to the inevitable truth. Georgina stood motionless, her eyes locked on the man who had been the center of her world for as long as she could remember, the same man who had now shattered everything she thought she knew about her life. "The game is over, mademoiselle." Poirot's voice was soft, yet it held an undeniable weight. "The truth is out, and we must face it." Chapter 12. The Final Confession. The room seemed to hold its breath, time seemingly slowing, as the reality of the situation settled over everyone. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, more intense, as though the house itself was counting down the final seconds of a long-kept secret. Georgina stood there, her body rigid, her mind struggling to comprehend the unraveling of everything she had once believed. Lionel Lawton, who had supposedly died nearly 20 years ago, was standing before her, alive, broken, and utterly defeated. "The truth has come crashing down," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying the full weight of the moment. "The years of lies, the silence, it's all unraveling now. There is no more hiding." Lionel, shaking with the weight of his confession, swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've hidden for too long, behind excuses, behind lies. But it's not just for me, it's for all of us." Beatrice Denham, whose face was now as pale as the moonlight streaming through the windows, stepped forward. Her expression was one of shock and deep hurt. "You let me believe that Alcester had died," she whispered, her voice breaking under the strain. "You let me carry that guilt for all these years. How could you do that to me?" Lionel's face twisted with sorrow, and he let out a shaky breath. "It wasn't a choice I made lightly," he murmured, "but it was the only way I could protect us all." But Beatrice, her eyes wide with disbelief, wasn't listening anymore. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "No, Lionel, you didn't protect anyone. You killed him. You murdered him, and discarded his body like it was nothing. You stole everything from him, everything." The words hung in the air, thick with accusation, and Lionel didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes, as though the weight of the truth was more than he could bear. "I didn't kill Alcester," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never wanted to, but I was forced." Beatrice's face contorted in confusion and disbelief. "Forced? By whom? Who could possibly force you?" Lionel's gaze dropped again, his eyes hollow with the weight of the past. "By her," he murmured, the words barely escaping his lips. The room fell into stunned silence. Beatrice's hand trembled at her side as she stepped back, her eyes wide with shock. Hastings, unable to contain himself any longer, stepped forward. "You're saying someone else was involved in this? Who?" Georgina blinked, the confusion in her eyes reflecting the storm raging within her. "Who was it, father?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lionel's eyes locked with hers, his face filled with sorrow, regret, and a deep, unspoken pain. It was Beatrice's mother, and your mother, Georgina. They were partners in everything. The words landed like a bombshell, detonating the fragile reality that had existed for all these years. Beatrice staggered back, her face drained of color, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. My mother, she gasped, her voice trembling with disbelief. What do you mean, Lionel? What are you saying? Lionel took a deep breath, steeling himself for the final confession. His voice trembled as he continued. I never wanted you to know, Georgina, but the truth is, your mother and Beatrice's mother were behind it all. They were the ones who pushed me, forced my hand. I couldn't fight them. They had too much power, too much influence. The room was deathly silent. The revelation hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder now, as if even time itself was holding its breath. The truth had been revealed, and everything, every carefully constructed lie, every deception that had spanned decades, was unraveling before their very eyes. The truth, once hidden deep in the shadows, had now emerged, and with it, everything they had ever known was in peril. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating with the weight of secrets that had long been buried, now clawing their way back into the light. Lionel Lawton, once a figure of power and control, now stood a broken man, his once firm and commanding presence diminished under the crushing burden of his own guilt. His hands trembled as he spoke, each word carrying the weight of years spent hiding the truth. I thought I could keep it hidden, he whispered, his voice barely audible, that I could bury the past and escape it. But in the end, the lies, they don't stay hidden forever. Hercule Poirot stood across from him, his eyes sharp and unwavering, a steady force amidst the unraveling chaos. You never meant to protect anyone, Monsieur Lawton. You only protected your own secrets. Poirot's voice was calm, but each word seemed to slice through the silence. Lionel's eyes flickered to the ground, unable to meet the gaze of the man who had seen through every facade he had built. It wasn't like that, Lionel protested, his voice cracking. I never wanted any of this. But the choices? They were made long ago, and I couldn't turn back. Poirot took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Lionel's, the weight of his presence commanding attention.
Who is the she you speak of? The one who pushed you into this web of lies and deceit?
Lionel's hands shook as he fumbled in his coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled yellowed letter. He held it up with reverence, as though it were the last remnant of a life he had long since abandoned. This is the only thing left of him, Lionel murmured, his voice heavy with sorrow. The letter Alistair sent me before he disappeared. He knew too much, and when he threatened to expose us, I couldn't let that happen. Poirot took the letter with a careful hand, unfolding it slowly, his eyes scanning the words. The handwriting was unmistakable. Alistair's. The message was blunt, urgent, a final warning. Father, I know what you've done. I know about the false deals, the crimes your partners committed. This is my last warning. If you care for your family's name, if you care for what remains of your reputation, you will listen to me. You will meet me at the old warehouse tonight. Alone. If you don't, I will make sure everyone knows the truth. Poirot read the letter twice before looking back at Lionel, his expression grave. You silenced him, Poirot said, his voice quiet, but the accusation hung in the air like a cold wind. Lionel's face twisted with the pain of his confession. No, he whispered. We didn't kill him, but we had him disappear. For the sake of everything we'd built, for the sake of what she wanted. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Who is she? Lionel hesitated, his breath shallow. He looked at Georgina, standing in the doorway, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. Your mother, he said quietly. She was as involved as I was. She was the one who insisted Alistair must go. Georgina's knees nearly buckled beneath her, as the truth hit her like a tidal wave. No, she was nothing like that, she stammered, her voice shaking. Lionel looked at her with deep regret, his voice filled with sorrow. She wasn't the saint you believed her to be, Georgina. She protected the family. Yes, but she also set it all into motion. She was the one who ordered Alistair's disappearance. And it was all for the family's reputation. For the empire we built on lies. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Georgina's heart raced, her mind struggling to process the horrific truth unfolding before her. The woman she had always looked up to, the mother she thought she knew, had been complicit in everything. Poirot's gaze was unyielding, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. So after Alistair's disappearance, you thought you were safe. But you were wrong. The past always catches up, Monsieur Lawton. The truth is like a shadow. It never stays hidden forever. Lionel closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. I thought I had buried it all. I thought I could outrun it. But I was wrong. Alistair was right. You can't escape the past. Georgina, now trembling with disbelief, took a step forward, her voice a broken whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Lionel reached out, his hands trembling as he tried to comfort her. But she recoiled, her eyes filled with a mixture of heartbreak and rage. I wanted to protect you, Lionel said, his voice cracking. I didn't want you to know the horrible things we did. I didn't want you to hate me. Hate you. Georgina's voice broke, her chest tightening with anger. You lied to me for my whole life. You made me believe in a lie, in a perfect family. When all this time, everything was a lie. Poirot stepped between them, his presence calm yet firm. The truth is out now, mademoiselle. No more lies. No more secrets. You must face it. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in with the weight of years of deception. The letter, the confession, the chilling realization of what had been done. It was all crashing down, and there was no escape. Lionel had thought he could hide behind his lies, behind his family's empire. But now the truth had emerged, and it would not be silenced. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, and for the first time, Georgina felt it, the suffocating realization that everything she had believed, everything she had known about her family, was a carefully woven illusion. Lionel's words, once a comfort, now echoed in her ears like a distant warning. He had always promised to protect her, to shield her from the darkness of their past. But now as the fog of deception lifted, she saw it all. The family she had cherished, the man she called father, had been the architects of a monstrous web of lies, deceit, and betrayal. Her eyes searched Lionel's face, desperate for any sign of remorse. But all she saw was a man broken by his own guilt, unable to look her in the eye. Georgina, I wanted to protect you, Lionel whispered, his voice trembling as if the weight of his confession was too much to bear. But sometimes protecting you meant keeping you in the dark. The words cold and hollow, stung like ice. How could she have been so blind? How could she have trusted them all these years? As she stood there, trembling, her world shattered at her feet, the sharp sound of a door creaking open broke the silence. Poirot entered, his gaze calm but piercing, as if he had known all along what would unfold in this room. The truth is like a shadow, mademoiselle, he said softly, his voice steady as always. No matter how you try to escape it, it always finds you. And now it's time for you to face it. Georgina's heart raced as the room seemed to close in on her, every tick of the clock louder, more oppressive. She had been living in the past, clinging to memories of a family that never truly existed. Now she was faced with the impossible choice of letting go, or succumbing to the very darkness that had been hidden from her. And then, as if on cue, the law arrived. Inspector Morris, his eyes hardened with resolve, his team of officers behind him. The weight of the moment hung in the air like the calm before a storm. Mr. Poirot, Morris said, his voice carrying a quiet gravity. We've gone through the old case files again. Everything you said, everything we've uncovered. It's all leading to the same conclusion. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and the Lawtons' empire of lies was finally crumbling. But the real question remained. Would Georgina have the strength to confront her past? Or would she remain trapped in the chains of her family's secrets, unable to break free? Only time would tell. Poirot stood still, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him like a thick fog. The air in the room felt heavier than ever before, the walls closing in with every passing second. The Lawtons had spent years spinning their web of lies, carefully concealing the truth beneath layers of deception. But now, like a relentless tide, the truth had come crashing through their defenses, sweeping away the carefully constructed facade. As Inspector Morris entered, his face was tense, eyes darting nervously as he stepped toward Poirot. There was a palpable sense of urgency in his every movement, as though the weight of their investigation had become too much for him to bear. "Mr. Poirot," Morris said, his voice strained but resolute, "we've been over the evidence again and again. The documents, the records, everything. It's all coming together. What's our next move?" Poirot's gaze was distant, as if he were searching for something beyond the present moment. His face remained unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. "We wait, Inspector," Poirot replied, his voice calm yet filled with an almost eerie certainty. "The truth is like time, slow, unyielding and patient. It doesn't rush, but when it finally catches up with you, there's no escaping it." Morris furrowed his brow in confusion, frustration creeping into his features. "So we just wait." Poirot nodded, his footsteps echoing softly as he motioned for Morris to follow. "Yes, we wait. The truth will reveal itself in its own time, but be assured, it always does." As the two of them walked down the long, silent hallway, Poirot's mind wandered back to the events of the night before. He couldn't shake the image of Georgina's face as her father, Lionel Lawton, had finally confessed the truth, the betrayal, the lies, the crushing weight of it all. Georgina's eyes had held such a mixture of disbelief and grief, as if the very ground beneath her feet had been ripped away in an instant. She had trusted her parents, loved them blindly, and now that trust was shattered beyond repair. It was a moment of irreversible change, a moment where the world she had known was no longer hers to hold. Georgina had left shortly after the confession, her decision clear. Poirot had watched her walk away, her steps heavy with the burden of a past she could no longer escape. She had gone to Reverend Harrove, the vicar who had known her family for many years. Poirot understood the need for guidance, for a path forward, but he also understood the torment she must have been feeling, the pull between the woman she had become and the girl who had once believed in the sanctity of family. It was a battle that would take time to resolve, and yet time was something Georgina could not afford. The law would catch up to Lionel Lawton eventually, that much was certain. But Poirot knew all too well that justice, though inevitable, was rarely swift. The question that lingered, the question that hung in the air like an unspoken curse, was whether the truth alone would be enough to set things right. Time, after all, had its own way of twisting everything into something unrecognizable. That evening, when Georgina returned, it was clear to Poirot that her conversation with the vicar had not been an easy one. Her eyes were red from crying, the sadness in her expression telling a story of its own. But there was something else there too, something new. A certain determination had begun to take root, a resolve that Poirot had not seen before. As Georgina entered the drawing room, she moved slowly, her footsteps hesitant yet purposeful. Poirot rose from his chair and bowed slightly, his demeanor respectful, yet he could not hide the concern that flickered in his eyes. "Mademoiselle," he greeted, his voice soft, filled with genuine care. "How are you?" Georgina sat down in front of him, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She looked at him, her eyes tired but unwavering. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of her words. "I'm leaving." Poirot's gaze softened, and he nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. "Leaving?" he asked gently, though he knew the answer already. Georgina's gaze shifted to the door, where her father had been only moments before. The air seemed to grow colder with the mention of his name, the tension in the room rising. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm but filled with sadness. I can't stay here. Not with him. Not with all of this. I can't live in the shadow of their lies anymore. I need to move on. Poirot at her for a moment, his eyes studying her carefully. He could see the pain in her eyes, but also something else. A strength, a newfound courage. And where will you go? He asked, his voice quiet, almost as if testing the waters. To London, Georgina said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I don't know exactly what I'll do there, but I will find a way. I have to. I can't go back to who I was before. I have to find my own path, my own freedom. Poirot nodded slowly, his face filled with understanding. Freedom is a rare thing, mademoiselle, he said softly, his gaze penetrating. It is never an easy choice, but it is always the right one. As Georgina stood to leave, there was a quiet moment of silence between them, as if both of them were waiting for something. Poirot, however, could not let her go without imparting one final thought. Remember this, mademoiselle, he said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. Time may have its laws, its rules, but the heart has its own rules. Georgina paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Thank you, Mr. Poirot, she whispered, her voice barely audible, for showing me that. With those words, she left the room, and the sound of the door closing behind her seemed to echo in the stillness. The ticking of the clocks in the distance seemed louder now, more insistent, reminding Poirot of the passage of time. Time once spent could never be regained. The days that followed passed in a haze, the atmosphere in Dorrington Chase shifting with each passing hour. The once oppressive silence now felt almost empty, like a house of ghosts. The clocks, which had always been a constant, now ticked with a strange rhythm, as though they, too, were resigned to the truth that had unfolded. Georgina had gone, just as she had promised, leaving behind nothing but a small suitcase, and a future that remained uncertain. Poirot had seen her off early that morning, his heart heavy with the knowledge that she was now walking a path that could never be undone. As for Lionel Lawton, his fate was sealed, but the question remained, would the truth in the end be enough to redeem him, or would it be his undoing? Time, as always, would tell. Poirot sat in the dimly lit study, his mind running through the twisted, tangled web of lies and deceit that had enveloped Dorrington Chase. The silence was thick with the weight of what had transpired. Georgina's departure, Lionel Lawton's confession, and the looming presence of truth that hung over everything like an unshakable shadow. There was something unsettling in the air, as though the house itself had absorbed the darkness of the past, and was now exhaling its final breath. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the only sound in the room, but even that seemed to be consumed by the silence that had settled like dust in every corner. The papers before him, records of a family steeped in betrayal, lay scattered across the desk, pieces of a puzzle that should have fit together long ago, but remained incomplete, like the answers he sought. As Poirot's fingers traced the edges of the documents, his mind wandered to the faces of those he had come to know in the house. Georgina, with her fragile yet resilient spirit, the haunted eyes of Lionel Lawton, and the elusive Beatrice Denham, who had slipped through their grasp like smoke. Hastings Poirot, his voice breaking the silence without him even looking up. I assume you're wondering whether we've reached the end of this long journey. Hastings entered, a heavy envelope clutched in his hand, his face drawn with exhaustion. The authorities have sorted it out. The trial is set to begin soon. Lawton will stand before them, answer for his crimes, he said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of everything that had come before. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable, yet something flickered in his eyes, an understanding that went deeper than the mere words spoken. And Beatrice Denham? He asked, his voice low, carrying the weight of a question that had haunted him for days. Hastings hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the fire, watching the flames dance in erratic patterns. She's gone, Poirot, Vanished. The police think she's in France. But no one's been able to track her down. She's got a way of disappearing. Poirot's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. She always did, didn't she? First with Alistair, and now with the truth, he mused, his gaze turning back to the fire, watching the embers glow like the fading remnants of a once bright flame. Do you think she'll return to face the consequences? Hastings asked, his voice carrying a quiet uncertainty. She might, Poirot replied, his voice steady, though there was a certain finality in the way he spoke. But the real question is whether she can live with what she's done. The truth has a way of changing everything. It doesn't just destroy families. It breaks people. And when you're broken, there's no going back. Hastings sank into a nearby chair, his face reflecting the weight of those words. What about Georgina? He asked, his voice soft, as if testing the answer before it left his lips. Poirot leaned back in his chair, folding his hands neatly in front of him. Georgina, he said quietly, will rebuild. She has the strength to start over, to rise from the ashes of this wreckage. More than anyone in that house, she has the resolve to find a way forward. Hastings let out a breath, his eyes narrowing as he thought of the chaos that had consumed everything. It's a hell of a mess, Poirot. So many lies, so many lives, ruined. Poirot's smile was faint, but it wasn't one of humor. The truth is never clean, Hastings. It's always messy. It always leaves scars. But in the end, it's the only thing that can set you free. Just then, the grandfather clock chimed, deep, resounding strokes, each one echoing through the room like the toll of fate itself. 12 strokes. And then, to their surprise, a 13th, a final mournful chime that seemed to carry with it the weight of all that had come before. Poirot's eyes flicked to the clock, his mind briefly lost in thought as he pondered the significance of that unexpected sound. The clock strikes 13, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And yet, I suspect this will be the last time it does. Hastings looked at him, confusion clouding his features. The last time? Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the clock. The clocks have told their story, Hastings. The truth has come to light, and now, it is time for this house to move on. For those who remain, it is time to make peace with the past. Hastings, still uncertain, glanced around the room. You think this place will change after everything that's happened? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Poirot rose from his chair, and walked toward the window, his gaze drifting across the quiet garden below, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Change comes, whether we are ready for it or not, he said softly. The truth, like time itself, is a force of nature. It cannot be stopped, and once it has done its work, there is no going back. Hastings nodded slowly, as though processing the gravity of Poirot's words. He asked, his voice laced with something darker now. What will happen to him? The law will deal with Lionel Lawton, Poirot replied, his voice calm, but there was a hardness to it that matched the finality in his tone. As for the rest of us, we are left to pick up the pieces. But one thing is certain, time moves forward, and the past, no matter how much we wish to hold on to it, cannot be kept. The room fell into a long silence as the ticking of the clock resumed, each beat marking the passage of time, the unrelenting march toward whatever came next. For all that had been destroyed, there was still something undeniably powerful about the truth that had been unearthed. It was both a force of liberation and a catalyst for inevitable change. But in the end, it was the only thing that could finally set them all free. The morning air clung to the manor, like the memory of a scream never voiced, and as the mist curled through the hedgerows of Ravensmoor estate, Inspector Devlin stepped through the heavy oak doors, his coat still damp from the rain that had fallen like judgment through the night. In the dim study, surrounded by fractured reflections from the cracked mirror above the hearth, Elric Vane stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the hearth, where ashes still smoldered from the fire that had burned through more than wood. He's gone then, Devlin said quietly, setting the sealed envelope on the desk, its contents damning, irreversible, final. Elric nodded without turning. Yes, and not just gone, Inspector. Erased. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of years, of secrets so carefully arranged they had become a tapestry of lies. The truth, once buried beneath the cellar floorboards beside the bones of Callum Vane, had clawed its way to the surface like something undead, refusing to stay silent any longer. He confessed, Devlin added, his voice grave. Fraud, conspiracy, murder. We found the journals, the coded letters, the bricked-in door. Elric's voice was low, bitter. The truth is like rot, Inspector. Once it begins, it spreads. You can't seal it behind a wall forever. Devlin studied the man before him, not the noble heir the town remembered, but someone stripped bare by revelation. And Amara? He asked. A muscle twitched in Elric's jaw. Vanished. Just like she did after the fire. They say she boarded a train south. But Amara was always more shadow than substance. Devlin glanced toward the broken window. Beyond it, the dawn crept reluctantly over the hills, and yet the darkness inside the manor remained unbroken. The coroner's report confirms it, he said. The body was Callum's. It was murder. Cold. Calculated. Forgotten. Until now. Elric finally turned to face him, his eyes hollow but burning with something else. Conviction perhaps. Or a final sense of peace. This place will never be free, Inspector. Not really. But those who survive it might be. He walked toward the grandfather clock, its hands frozen at midnight, unmoving since the night Callum died. He placed a single key on the mantel. The house has kept its secrets long enough. Let it rest. As Devlin prepared to leave, the old clock gave a groan, then ticked once, just once, as though acknowledging the end of its burden. Outside, the wind rose, lifting the fog just enough to reveal the worn gravestones on the edge of the property, each one a name that had shaped this tragedy. Time had delivered its verdict. And now finally, the reckoning was complete. The morning fog clung low to the trees surrounding Ashridge Hall, coiling like the remnants of long whispered secrets refusing to fade. Inside the dim study, the scent of old paper, cold ash, and something older, regret, lingered in the air. Detective Armand Vale stood by the hearth, silent, watching the embers lose their fight against the chill. He hadn't spoken since the confession. Not aloud at least. Across from him, Inspector Rennick fumbled through the last of the official files, but his eyes kept drifting back to the heavy velvet curtains, half expecting them to move. So it's done then, Rennick muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Vale finally stirred, his voice quiet, heavy. The law may have caught the criminal, but the truth. He paused, gazing at the dark window. The truth has only just begun its work. Rennick tilted his head. You mean Eleanor's letter? Vale turned slowly, his eyes gleaming with the gravity of something unsaid. She knew what no one else dared to speak. She carried it alone, for years. But the truth always surfaces, Inspector, sometimes slowly, like water rising beneath floorboards, sometimes all at once, like a scream in the dark. Just then, the hallway clock chimed. Not 12, but 13, its discordant ring slicing through the silence like a blade. Rennick jolted, unnerved. It's faulty, he muttered. Or perhaps, Vale said, it's marking the hour of reckoning. The inspector laughed uneasily, but said nothing more. Minutes passed in slow, deliberate silence until the butler arrived, letter in hand, aged paper, sealed in black wax. Delivered this morning, sir. No name, no return. Vale opened it without hesitation, scanning the lines with growing intensity. When he finished, he closed his eyes briefly. It's from the groundskeeper. He buried more than roses here. Rennick stepped forward, eyes wide. More bodies. Vale nodded, folding the letter tightly. beneath the northern hedge. The night Miss Eleanor vanished, someone else died too. A boy named Owen, a witness who saw what he shouldn't have. Rennick's mouth went dry. And no one ever. They silenced him, Vale interrupted, and turned the soil over, like they were planting a future. But roots don't forget. Within the hour the dig began. By dusk, bones wrapped in an old shawl surfaced, clutching a child's locket etched with the initials E. de Lenars. Vale stood over the grave, coat flapping in the wind, eyes burning with something between victory and sorrow. Ashridge Hall kept its secrets well, he said. But not forever. As police sealed off the site and the first stars pierced the sky, Vale walked the hallway once more, his footsteps echoing like a final verdict. Some truths, he said, to no one in particular, don't just reveal the past, they demand we question everything that follows. And as the 13th hour rang again, louder this time, it was no longer a sound of mystery, but of finality. The house, the lies, the silence, all unraveling into something new, something unknown, yet irrevocably honest. Dust swirled across the deserted road, as Inspector Rohan Melik sat silently in the back seat of the car, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the old manor house that was slowly disappearing in the rearview mirror. Though they had left the place behind, his mind hadn't moved on. It lingered in those crumbling halls and silent corridors, where secrets had whispered through the very walls. His hands, neatly folded in his lap, betrayed none of the turbulence he felt inside. Every case left a mark, but this one had reached somewhere deeper, somewhere time itself seemed to have hidden the truth beneath layers of guilt, grief and forgotten sins. Seymour, his trusted driver, who had accompanied him on many such investigations, glanced at him through the mirror, sensing the weight that now hung in the car like unspoken words. "Sir," he asked cautiously, "do you think she'll really be able to start over?" Rohan didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained distant, lost in thought. After a moment he spoke, his voice low, measured. "A new beginning isn't something you stumble into, Seymour. It's something you earn. Through truth, through pain, through the kind of acceptance that scars more than it heals. She's made a choice, that's the first step, but the road ahead, that won't be easy." Seymour hesitated before asking, "And her father, will the law be enough?" Rohan finally turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "The law will handle him, yes. But some punishments go beyond courtrooms. Some are served in silence, in the dark, in memory, in regret. There are wounds the law cannot touch." The car rolled on, the manor house now completely out of sight, replaced by open fields under a fading sky. Rohan closed his eyes for a moment, but all he could see were the final moments of confrontation. The trembling confession, the unraveling lies, the ticking grandfather clock that had marked each revelation like a slow drumbeat of fate. "Time," he muttered to himself, "isn't just something we live in, it's something that watches us, waits for us to face what we've buried." When they reached the city, Rohan asked to be dropped at his apartment. Seymour helped him inside, and as Rohan poured them both a glass of wine, the silence between them thickened, not uncomfortable, but dense with meaning. "Well, sir," Seymour said, trying to lighten the moment, "it's over, isn't it? Time to move on." Rohan looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "You're wrong, Seymour. We never really move on, not completely. The past, especially the truths we uncover, stay with us. We carry them whether we want to or not. They live in our hearts, in the spaces between what we say and what we don't." Seymour gave a small knowing smile. "You're getting philosophical again, sir." Rohan allowed a faint smirk. "Perhaps. But this case taught me something simple. Time is relentless. It demands answers. No matter how fast we run, no matter how deep we hide, the truth always finds a way to surface." He paused, lifting his glass. "And sometimes, the truth isn't the end of the story. It's just where the real one begins." Seymour nodded, clinking his glass gently against Rohan's. Just as the calm began to settle, the phone rang, slicing through the stillness. Rohan stared at it, a flicker of tension passing through his eyes. It was rare for a case to follow him home. Rarer still for a voice from the past to echo into the present. He picked up the receiver slowly. Inspector Mellick speaking. The voice on the other end was familiar, but laced with urgency, like a shadow that had slipped back into the light. Inspector, we need you again. There's been another body. And this time, it's someone closer to the last case than you think. Rohan's grip on the phone tightened, the echo of the ticking clock from the manor, returning to his mind like a haunting rhythm. The past, it seemed, wasn't finished with him yet, and neither was the truth. The sky had turned a bruised shade of violet, as Inspector Amir Shah arrived at Greystone Hollow, the estate now hollow, and echoing with secrets that had clawed their way out of the shadows. A call just an hour prior had shattered the fragile silence left behind after the recent closure of the Harrogate case. A new voice, tight with urgency, had whispered of a discovery beneath the stone foundation of the manor, something sealed away long before the fire that had gutted the West Wing. Amir had wasted no time. Now as he stepped through the decaying threshold with Constable Irfan at his side, he was met by Superintendent Hale, whose face was paler than the storm-lit sky outside. "We thought we had catalogued everything," Hale muttered, guiding them through the grand hall where dust hung in the air like ghosts. "But there's a concealed passage in the cellar, a section behind the furnace. We believe it was never on the original blueprints." Amir's heart thudded harder. Every instinct in him stirred as he descended the stone steps into the cold earth beneath the house. There in the hidden chamber, lay a chest of velvet-lined oak, and inside it, a leather-bound journal, stained and curling at the edges. His gloved hands trembled slightly, as he turned the brittle pages, each line penned in a slanted, almost frantic script. It was a private record kept by Elias Blackthorne, the patriarch thought lost in the 1927 avalanche, supposedly buried beneath snow. But as the entries revealed, that too was a lie. The last few pages grew darker with each word, confessions of bribery, of a pact forged in blood between the Blackthorns and the influential Mallory clan, and a mention of a child, hidden, unnamed, disinherited. They promised protection in exchange for silence. Elias had written, "But silence is a living thing, it grows fangs." Amir's breath caught as he reached the final entry. "If you found this, then know the curse was not fate, it was our doing. We opened the door, and now the shadows have come to collect." Irfan swallowed hard beside him. "Sir, what does it mean?" Amir looked up, his eyes distant but focused. "It means we were wrong. The fire, the disappearances, the suicides. None of them were accidents. This was rot, rooted deep. Generations deep. They returned to the surface, and though the night wind was cool, Amir felt a fever behind his eyes. Back at his office in the city, surrounded by silence and pages now spread across the desk like a puzzle made of ghosts, he couldn't shake the feeling that the case wasn't just a historical tragedy, it was an inheritance, passed down through blood and silence. The courts would have their trials, the papers their headlines, but justice had already come, one death at a time. And as Amir poured himself a measure of brandy, the phone rang again, once, twice, before he picked it up. The voice on the other end whispered just one word before the line cut. "Another." His hand froze mid-air. Glass forgotten. The shadows hadn't finished. The hollow still had more to say. On a cold, silent evening, an unexpected call pierced the quiet. Inspector Darcy's voice trembled on the other end. "Mr. Vere, we've discovered something beneath the old chapel floorboards at Gravenhall Estate. It's deeply disturbing." Veer Malhotra, a private investigator known for his razor-sharp mind and a gaze that could unearth truths long buried, stiffened. He had closed the Gravenhall case weeks ago, or so he believed. Within the hour, he was back at that cursed, decaying estate, where silence hung like a shroud and the air reeked of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Inspector Darcy met him at the wrought iron gates, face pale, voice low. "We missed something the first time. There's a hidden vault beneath the chapel's altar. We assumed it was part of the old foundation, but we were wrong." As they descended into the earth, down crumbling stone steps, shrouded in mildew and shadow, the cold grew unbearable, biting at their skin like forgotten memories. In the dim light of a flickering lantern, they found it, a scorched iron chest sealed tight, buried beneath layers of dust and time. With great effort, they pried it open. Inside, wrapped in decaying oilcloth, were handwritten journals, pages aged and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. These were not mere journals. They were confessions, testimonies of madness. Dated in shaky hands, each entry revealed the slow unraveling of a legacy steeped in betrayal, ritual, and blood. The words belonged to Olivia Gravenhall herself, the long-lost matriarch the world presumed dead. Her writing was urgent, frantic, soaked in terror. She wrote of secrets hidden beneath the estate, of rites disguised as charity, of sacrifices performed in the dead of night to keep an ancient evil bound beneath the chapel. To whoever dares uncover the truth, one entry began, "Know this, Gravenhall was never a sanctuary, it was a seal, and I was its last guardian." Vere read on, the words burning deeper with every line. The Gravenhalls had built an empire not just on lies and corruption, but on occult rituals, blood pacts, and forbidden knowledge passed down for generations. Olivia had tried to end it, to bury the truth, but even in death, it clawed its way back. "Why hide all this?" Darcy asked, his voice hushed, as if fearing the walls might listen. Vere closed the last page slowly, his voice grave. "Because this truth doesn't cleanse, it destroys. Some truths don't set you free, they bind you forever." In the days that followed, the authorities sealed the estate once more. The documents were taken for investigation, but Vere knew better. What had been unearthed couldn't be silenced. The media painted it as a historical scandal, a case of financial deceit, a fallen dynasty. But Vere had seen what lurked beneath, and late at night, as he sat alone in his office, rain tapping relentlessly against the glass, he would revisit Olivia's final chilling words. "The price of silence is always paid in blood." He understood now. The case hadn't ended. It had only awakened. Something ancient had been disturbed at Gravenhall, something that had waited for decades in the shadows. And it wasn't done yet. The real investigation was just beginning, and the cost of knowing might be far greater than ignorance ever was. On a storm-laced evening drenched in grey, where even the shadows seemed afraid to stretch too far, Detective Arman Saeed sat alone in the dim flicker of his study lamp, the bitter scent of old paper and colder truths thick in the air. Across from him, a sealed brown file lay unopened, its contents heavy with secrets long kept and lives forever altered. The Windmere estate case, officially closed, publicly forgotten, had left behind echoes that refused to die. Alara Vance, the daughter of the disgraced industrialist Donovan Vance, had finally uncovered the truth about her family's long-standing veil of deceit. But that truth came at a cost, one not measured in headlines or court rulings, but in the quiet, unshakable grief that settled in her bones. Her father was to stand trial for the atrocities he masked behind philanthropy, but Arman knew better than to believe that justice truly reached the depths it claimed. The estate, once teeming with silent servants and whispered corridors, now stood lifeless, a carcass hollowed out by decades of buried rot. Alara had walked away from it all, her legacy, her name, her ghosts, but the house, like time itself, bore scars that would never truly fade. Arman stared at the ticking clock beside him, each second thudding like a hammer on guilt's anvil. "Time doesn't heal," he whispered. "It remembers." His partner, Inspector Raheel, entered with a weary nod. "It's done, every thread tied, every lie unraveled. The board wants us off it now." Arman didn't look up. "And Alara?" Raheel paused, his voice softer. "She's vanished. No contact, no forwarding address. Just, gone." A silence fell, deep and hollow. "Perhaps that's the only justice she'll ever get," Arman murmured. "Escape." Raheel crossed to the window, staring out at the slick, rain-drenched streets. "And you? What now?" Arman finally opened the file, revealing the aged letter that had sparked the case, a confession wrapped in madness, penned by Alara's mother just days before her disappearance. "I keep searching," he replied, "because even if time buries the truth, someone must remember where it lies." The clock chimed the hour, and with it came a gust of wind through the cracked pane, carrying with it the scent of wet soil, old stone, and something else, something darker, older waiting. Armand didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that the deepest truths didn't just hide in the shadows, they became them. And he wasn't done walking into the dark. Not yet. Zaroon House now stood cloaked in an eerie silence, not the kind that calms, but one that unsettles, like a thick fog that clings to every corner and every crevice of the decaying walls. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the weight of history, of truths long buried, and voices long silenced, that filled the air. The house, once a symbol of power, prestige and privilege, had become a mausoleum for the past, a place where the very walls seemed to shudder with the secrets they had harbored. A storm had passed, but it wasn't one of thunder or rain. It was a storm of raw, jagged truths, crashing into the carefully constructed facades, splintering them into 1,000 fragments. The legacy of the Farrell family, once so untouchable, now lay in ruins, exposed for all to see. What had once been hidden in the deepest recesses of the house was now out in the open, like old wounds that refused to heal. Inspector Ryan sat in his dimly lit study, his eyes fixed on the worn folder that lay open before him. The soft flickering glow of the fireplace cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the edges of the report with a soft, almost haunting light. The smell of old parchment, mingled with the faint bitterness of his untouched coffee, its steam rising like the remnants of past regrets. The room was a sanctuary, a place where Ryan could think, could breathe, could try to piece together the fragments of a case that had unraveled in ways he hadn't anticipated. His mind wandered, not to the facts or the evidence that had been painstakingly collected, but to the faces of those whose lives had been irrevocably changed by the truth, the faces of those who would never again be the same. Outside, the wind howled through the bare trees, a constant reminder that the world continued on, indifferent to the wreckage left behind. It whispered through the streets, carrying with it the weight of all that had transpired. Across the city, Elena Farrell stepped out into the cold night, the chill of the evening air biting at her skin, as if the very atmosphere was aware of the burden she now carried. The letter in her coat pocket, tucked away, as if it was some kind of forgotten relic, was heavier than anything she had ever held in her life. It was from her mother, a confession written before her arrest, a confession that should have come years ago, but instead had arrived only after everything had been destroyed. The Farrell name, once untouchable, was now synonymous with scandal and deceit. The legacy that had once shielded them was now gone, stripped away by the relentless force of truth. Elena had never imagined that the price of discovery would be so high. Rayan had seen this before, in the faces of those who sought justice, only to find that what they thought was victory was, in fact, a kind of loss. It was a loss that took time to understand, a loss that didn't immediately reveal its true face. Justice, when it came, didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the closing of a door that had always been there but had remained unnoticed until the light was finally allowed to shine in. The realization that things would never be the same, could never be the same again, was the true cost of uncovering the truth. And yet, for all the pain and devastation it had caused, Rayan couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that stirred within him. It was a satisfaction born not of triumph, but of resolution. He had followed the threads, chased the shadows, and brought the truth to light. And in that truth, however bitter, there was peace. He stared at the ornate clock above the mantel, its ticking now the only sound in the room. It was louder, more pronounced now that everything else had fallen silent. Time, Rayan mused, was a cruel and unyielding force. It didn't seek to heal wounds. It simply exposed them. It didn't care about the hearts it broke, or the lives it shattered. Time demanded reckoning, not closure. It moved on, relentlessly, and in its wake it left behind nothing but the raw, exposed truth. A knock at the door broke his reverie, soft, almost tentative. It was Leon, the young assistant who had followed him through the labyrinth of lies. His eyes no longer filled with innocent admiration, but with the kind of understanding that only comes from knowing too much, too soon. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying an unspoken weight, "there's another letter. Miss Elena sent it. She's leaving the city. She says she's going to the coast to start over. Rayan took the letter with careful hands, unfolding it slowly, as if the act of reading it might somehow alter the course of everything that had come before. Her words, written with deliberate precision, were not filled with sorrow, but with a quiet, almost stoic resolve. "Thank you for the truth," she had written, "even when it hurt. I am not who I was, and maybe that's a good thing." Rayan folded the letter carefully, placing it on top of the case file with a sense of finality. The case was closed, yes, but the echoes of its unraveling would reverberate far beyond the walls of Zaroon House. The truth had been revealed, and though the immediate storm had passed, the consequences would continue to unfold. Outside, the city went on, its people unaware of the tectonic shift that had just occurred. But within the hearts of those who had been touched by the truth, something had irrevocably changed. The world might move forward, indifferent and unmoved by what had transpired. But for those who had walked through the flames, there would be no turning back. The case was closed, but the truth, like time itself, would endure, echoing long after the final pages had been turned. The evening had settled into an unsettling stillness, the kind that presses against your chest and fills the room with secrets waiting to be unearthed. The fire crackled softly, casting erratic shadows across the study. But within the warmth of the flickering flames, Inspector Rayan's thoughts were far from comfortable. The past weeks had brought him no peace, only the relentless pull of unanswered questions. Even when the case seemed wrapped up, there was something in the air, something unspoken that refused to dissipate. The truth, as it often did, lingered just out of reach, like an echo that wouldn't fade until every last detail had been revealed. Rayan's hand rested on the case file, his mind mulling over the tangled web of deception and deceit. When the doorbell rang, its chime shattering the silence like an unwelcome intruder, his brow furrowed. Who could be here at this hour? He rose, making his way to the door, and found Inspector Morris, standing on the threshold. His face was drawn, grim, his eyes betraying an urgency that Rayan couldn't ignore. Without waiting for an invitation, Morris stepped inside, his posture tense, as though he carried a weight that threatened to break him. "Rayan." His voice was low, filled with the kind of gravity that signaled nothing good. "I need to speak with you." Rayan gestured toward the chair near the fire, his expression unreadable. "Of course, sit down. Would you care for a drink?" Morris declined with a slight wave of his hand, his focus entirely on the matter at hand. "No thank you. I need to speak to you about something important. The case. It's not over. Not really." Rayan raised an eyebrow, the sudden shift in the air making his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Morris sighed, running a hand through his hair in agitation. "It's the Lawtons. Yes, they're being held accountable. But there's something I've uncovered. Something that doesn't sit right with me." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a thick, worn file, placing it on the table with deliberate slowness. Rayan's eyes followed the movement, a knot forming in his stomach as he studied Morris's nervous manner. "This is the missing piece," Morris continued, his voice tight with tension. "The one that doesn't fit." Rayan's curiosity piqued. His fingers brushed the edge of the file. "What piece is that?" "The letter," Morris said, voice dropping lower. "The letter that Alistair Lawton wrote to his father. The one that was supposed to be destroyed. But it's not. It's here, and it changes everything." Rayan's heart skipped a beat, as he reached for the file, unfolding it with careful hands. His eyes skimmed the pages, and then the familiar handwriting leapt at him. Alistair's scrawl, desperate and defiant. "Father, I know you're hiding the truth. I know what you've done, and I will expose it. The secrets you've buried are going to come to light. The family will pay for its sins, but I will do it my way. The truth will be told, even if it costs me everything. You can't silence me anymore. I will speak, and the world will hear." Rayan read the words over and over, the message clear, yet the tone struck him with an unsettling clarity. This wasn't just a threat. It was a vow. Alistair hadn't just been exposing the family's secrets. He had been preparing for war, and his declaration echoed with the weight of something far more dangerous than a mere confession. Rayan's fingers lingered over the edges of the paper, then met Morris's gaze. His voice steady, but filled with uncertainty. "What does this letter mean to you?" Morris's eyes darkened, his voice a murmur of doubt and realization. "The last time we saw Alastair, he was already preparing to expose the Lawtons. He had proof, Rayan. And now, after everything that's happened, I'm beginning to think there's more to this than we've realized." His voice dropped to a whisper, his gaze darting around the room, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "I don't think he died by accident. Someone wanted to keep him quiet." Rayan's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind, like pieces of a shattered mirror, each fragment showing him a different disturbing picture. "But we have all the answers," he started, his voice trailing off. "The ledgers, the confession from Lionel Lawton, everything." Morris shook his head, his fingers trembling slightly as they pressed against the edge of the file. "It's not enough. There's still one thing we've never found: Alastair's files. The documents he claimed to have. They're missing. The letter, the confession, they're here. But the proof, the thing that ties everything together, is gone." Rayan's hand gripped the edge of the desk, his thoughts a tangled mess as he fought to comprehend the weight of what was unfolding before him. This wasn't just a case about the Lawtons. This was something far more sinister, something that no one, not even the truth itself, could escape. The missing files, the confession, the letter. It all pointed to one undeniable fact: there was someone out there, someone still watching, still hiding in the shadows, pulling strings and orchestrating the chaos that had turned this investigation into a deadly game. The rain fell relentlessly, a quiet symphony against the windows, as Poirot sat by the flickering fire, his mind in turmoil. The warmth from the hearth offered no comfort this time. His thoughts were far from peaceful, chasing the elusive threads of a case that had haunted him for weeks. Even in the stillness of his study, the mystery gnawed at him, demanding resolution. Inspector Morris's arrival had shattered his fleeting hope of respite. The man stood at the door, his expression grim, the weight of something unsaid hanging in the air. "Poirot." Morris's voice was low but urgent. "I need to speak with you. It's not over. Not by a long shot." Poirot rose, a sense of dread tightening in his chest. The door clicked shut behind him as Morris stepped inside, his eyes dark with the truth yet to be fully revealed. "The Lawtons are being held accountable." "Yes," Morris continued. "But there's something about all this, something I missed before, something that doesn't add up." With trembling hands he pulled a thick file from under his coat, placing it gently on the table between them. Poirot's gaze was drawn to the folder, its contents holding secrets that could shift everything he thought he knew. "This," Morris said, his voice tight, "this is the missing piece, the one that doesn't fit." Poirot reached for the file, his fingers brushing the edges. Inside, a letter lay folded, its paper yellowed with age. His heart skipped a beat. He unfolded it with deliberate care. "Father," it began, the handwriting unmistakable. "I know you're hiding the truth. I know what you've done, and I will expose it. The secrets you've buried will come to light, and the family will pay. But I will do it my way, and the world will hear my voice." Poirot's brow furrowed as he read it again, his mind turning over the implications. Alastair's final message was not just a threat, it was a challenge, a defiant promise to unravel the family's darkest secrets. The tone was unyielding, an edge of desperation cutting through each word. He placed the letter down, meeting Morris's gaze with new urgency. "This letter, what does it tell you?" Morris exhaled sharply, his hand trembling slightly. When Alastair started asking questions, he was already planning to expose them all. The Lawtons, the Denhams. But it was Julian Denham who had the most to fear. And when Alastair found out about the smuggling ring, I believe Denham knew he had to act, before the truth destroyed everything. Poirot's mind raced, each new revelation like a piece of a puzzle, finally snapping into place. "So you believe Denham had him killed?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but laced with a deadly certainty. Morris nodded, his face pale. Yes. And now, he's been hiding the evidence ever since. The urgency in Poirot's chest grew. But we have all the evidence. The confessions. The ledgers. The admissions. We know the truth. Not all of it, Morris countered. Alistair kept something hidden. Something that could bring it all crashing down. The missing files, Poirot. The ones he said he had. They're gone. And that, Poirot, is what we must find. Poirot's gaze drifted to the clock on the mantel, its ticking echoing in the silence. Time, always the measure of their pursuit, was now the final key. We will find it, Inspector, Poirot said, his voice steady, a resolve hardening in his chest. The final piece of the puzzle is within reach. And when we have it, the truth will no longer be denied. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Poirot's mind burned with the image of the missing files, and the pieces he had overlooked slowly came together. Finally, as dawn broke, Hastings arrived, his steps heavy but relieved. "It's done," he said, his voice grave but tinged with finality. He placed a folder on the desk between them. "The Lawtons, the Denims. It's all connected. The smuggling ring, the falsified records, Julian Denham's role. We have it all." Poirot opened the folder slowly, his fingers brushing the edges of the documents inside. "And the missing documents?" he asked. "They've been found," Hastings replied. "Julian Denham thought they were locked away forever, in a hidden compartment in his estate. But now we have them. All the proof we need." Poirot leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling in. "But something still doesn't sit right," he murmured. "The truth is there, clear for all to see, yet it lingers, like a shadow that won't fade." Hastings frowned, confused. "Isn't it clear? The Lawtons were behind it. Denham helped them. Alistair died because he threatened to expose them all." Poirot's eyes narrowed, a glint of realization lighting them. "Yes, Hastings. But there is something more, something we missed all along." He stared at the clock, its ticking now louder, more insistent. "The clocks," Poirot said, his voice unwavering. "They've been the key from the very beginning. They always were."